He was a vibrant teenager, popular amongst his peers.
He was a lovable young man, very sweet, Kendrick Hart.
And he found a deep connection with a beautiful classmate.
They were just like two peas in a pod.
The future was looking bright for both of them.
But that promising future is cut short in a hail of bullets.
He was shot multiple times all over his body. The chest, his hands, his back.
The hunt for suspects will lead police on a high-speed chase.
They jumped out of the vehicle and take off on foot.
And a conniving plot to kill will be revealed.
You really don't want to get on his bad side. Like, something wrong with him.
He found out she had gotten pregnant.
You get a message from a pretty girl saying, hey, let's meet up, just the two of us. No teenage boy is going to turn that down.
He was just at the wrong place at the wrong time.
I think police ready to feel like you got scared, really.
As the investigation unfolds, loyalties will be tested.
He said that she snitched.
Oh, so dumb. He had to run, though.
And bonds will be broken.
I can distinctly remember hearing one woman screaming, burn in hell, burn in hell.
This was an act of rage.
December 8th, 2021, Clarksville, Tennessee. It's a chilly night in this historic community, about 50 miles northwest of Nashville.
Clarksville is a mid-sized city, which only has about 160,000 people, and it's on the eve of the holidays. So it's bright, it's cheery.
You got Christmas decoration in the yard, lights hanging from the houses.
But at 8:42 p.m., the peaceful night is interrupted by the sound of gunshots on the city's east side.
A bunch of phone calls started to flood the police station.
This is 911.
I think I heard a shooting. I heard a gun going off. Pop, 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 pop.
I heard about 10 loud bangs that sounded like gunshots, not fireworks.
Someone is in the middle of the street been shot. It's a male. Black male with dreams. Hurry, hurry, hurry.
Police and emergency responders mobilize.
They're dispatched to the scene. Neighbors are frantic. Everyone runs out to the street to see what just happened.
A man was faced up in the middle of the street. His body was riddled with bullet holes.
I heard shots. And I'm like, where's my cousin? And then we came out to find him, and it was him.
First responders learned the victim is 17-year-old Armani Majors.
Armani Majors was a Nashville native who was currently living with his aunt's family in Clarksville.
Everybody loved him. He's always happy-go-lucky.
Armani was a young man becoming an adult. He was doing well in school, and he was doing well with his family.
So how's work been going?
Really good. I'm actually taking on some extra hours this week also.
I'm so proud of you.
He had a job at a fast food restaurant, and he was proud that he was earning money. He also knew how to prioritize things that really mattered to him, like God and family.
He and his family were very active in their church.
At his high school, Armani's outgoing personality made him popular amongst his peers.
He was very handsome, very charming.
He was a lovable young man. He was very popular, but most importantly, very sweet, Kendrick Hart.
But Armani held a special place in his heart for one particular classmate, 18-year-old Miracle Bailey.
How you doing?
All right, how you doing? Come on.
Good. I miss you today.
I missed you too.
They met each other early on in their high school years.
Miracle was a lot like Armani, and they instantly hit it off. They were very chill, and they vibed together.
You want to come over after school today?
Yeah.
Okay, we can do that. Okay, cool, cool.
They were just like two peas in a pod. She was a female version of who he was, and they stayed together throughout a long period of time.
They were your typical high school students, and they dated from freshman year all the way to senior year.
The future was looking bright for both of them.
They were doing good. They were just moving everything in the right direction.
But just 4 months into his senior year, Armani has been gunned down in front of his relative's home.
They realized that he was not only shot once in the head, but he was shot multiple times all over his body. The chest, his hands, his back.
They found 14 shots in Armani's body.
Armani's injuries are so severe, nothing can be done to help him.
Ultimately, he succumbed to his injuries, and they could not save his life.
Armani was already dead.
We're gonna need homicide here immediately.
When homicide detectives arrive on the scene, they too are struck by the viciousness of the crime.
Looking at Armani, the numerous gunshot wounds in his body, the thing that stuck out about it, besides the multitude of them, would have been how dispersed they were. The one that sticks out foremost in my mind is one through one of his fingers, which is consistent with putting up his hands in front of his face because of how rapidly the assault and murder took place.
Surrounding Armani's body, investigators find numerous .40 caliber shell casings.
The glisten of the street lights, you could very well pick up a lot of the shell casings that are out there.
But Armani doesn't appear to have been robbed.
All his belongings are still intact.
So it certainly spoke to a personal element. You're looking at somebody that knew this victim.
17-year-old Armani Majors may have been young, but he was already making a big impact on those around him.
His life was flowing. It was just flowing.
He was a high school senior who also worked at a local fast food restaurant. He had lots of friends and family that loved him.
But Armani's short life has come to a tragic end after he's gunned down in front of his Clarksville, Tennessee home.
Armani had been shot 14 times.
Investigators don't think this crime was a robbery gone wrong.
All his belongings are still intact.
When investigators pat down Armani's body, they found a small bag of marijuana as well as $50 of cash.
Could the marijuana be a clue to the killer's motive?
It wasn't a lot to go by, but they were trying to take any lead that they necessarily could, and they was thinking, could this be drug-related?
Investigators also locate a cell phone nearby.
They're not sure if it's Armani's phone or if it's a phone belonging to a potential suspect.
Then, investigators notice something unusual. Tire tracks cutting across a nearby lawn.
It looks like the gunmen might have turned their vehicle around in the neighbor's lawn when they fled away from the scene. Unfortunately, there are only slight impressions in the grass, so the officers are not able to track them to a specific type of wheel from a vehicle.
In their search for answers, detectives turn to Armani's devastated family members.
There were a number of family members that showed up. It was a full house of love and support there.
I just can't believe this is happening.
They were completely distraught, but they were able to get themselves together enough to be able to tell detectives what they knew.
They were just with Armani moments before the shooting took place.
According to Armani's family, the shooting occurred after a trip to the grocery store.
They were putting groceries away when Armani got a video call on his cell phone.
Come on now. Let's get this stuff put up.
What's up? Hey.
So, did you come in outside?
Unfortunately, they didn't know who called Armani. They just noticed it was a female.
He had told his aunt that he was walking down the street and that he'd be right back.
Hold on. Hey, I'll be right back, okay?
Okay, honey. Come on, let's get this stuff put up.
That was the last time they saw him alive.
Right after Armani walks outside, they hear shooting. By the time they ran outside to check on Armani, the shooter was already gone.
It all happened so fast.
The family confirms the cell phone found at the scene belonged to Armani.
Investigators are eager to send the phone out for forensics.
Maybe they could identify who was he talking to when he got the phone call to come outside.
After speaking with the family, investigators canvassed the neighborhood for witnesses.
They spoke to a neighbor named Jackson Shepard, who lived right across the street from where Armani was shot.
Okay, Jackson, tell us what happened.
Jackson tells detectives around 8 p.m. he heard gunshots and went outside to see if anyone was hurt.
As he stepped outside, he saw a black Jeep Cherokee speeding away.
Then he saw Armani.
He saw Armani lying in the street, and he rushed to him to render aid.
He didn't just stick his head out of the door. He came out to attempt to save Armani's life.
After speaking with Jackson, police issue an all-points bulletin to law enforcement throughout the county.
I want to put out an APB for a black Jeep Cherokee. I want all patrol officers keeping an eye out for that vehicle.
And within minutes of sending out the alert, they catch a lucky break.
They were able to locate the vehicle and immediately started a high-speed chase.
Tennessee detectives are investigating the deadly shooting of 17-year-old Armani Majors, who was gunned down in a hail of bullets outside his aunt's home in Clarksville.
A neighbor witnessed the shooter speeding away from the crime scene.
I want all patrol officers keeping an eye out for that vehicle.
Just moments later, Montgomery County Sheriff's Police spot the black Jeep Cherokee.
Deputies viewed that vehicle traveling at a high rate of speed not far from the crime scene. Those deputies moved forward to pursue that vehicle.
And they attempt to initiate a traffic stop. However, the vehicle doesn't stop when the sirens come on. Instead, they started to pick up speed.
The officers pursued the vehicle in a high-speed chase, bobbing and weaving through the heart of downtown Clarksville.
Then in a residential area at Ernest Shelton Drive in Lincoln, the vehicle comes to an abrupt stop.
Two suspects jumped out of the vehicle and take off on foot.
The passenger of the vehicle takes off in one direction while the driver runs off in a completely different direction.
Officers are forced to make a split-second decision on whom to pursue.
This is common with most vehicle pursuits. When multiple people flee from the vehicle, officers are going to try and go after the driver of that vehicle on foot.
Unfortunately, the passenger was able to evade capture.
But the driver isn't so lucky.
Stop! Eventually, they were able to corner him.
Hold it right there, boy. Keep your hands up. Keep them up, keep them up, keep them up, man. Hold it.
They were able to handcuff him and take him into custody. They quickly identified him as 18-year-old Nashville resident Robert Holland.
And as they retrace his steps, police find more evidence that suggests Robert is Armani's killer.
They discovered a Glock handgun directly in his path of flight.
It's a .40 caliber, which matches the shell casings located at the crime scene.
When investigators process the car Robert has been driving, they make another alarming discovery.
The vehicle ended up actually being stolen.
3 days earlier, a man had reported the vehicle missing, alleging that a woman he met at a local hotel robbed him.
She also made off with his cell phone and wallet, but he never got her real name. She only went by the nickname of Barbie.
Could Barbie be the second assailant, the one who evaded capture? Investigators search the inside of the vehicle for more clues.
As soon as they open the door of the car, they're hit with the smell of marijuana. Then the police noticed a substantial quantity of what appeared to be crack cocaine hidden under one of the seats.
They also found 13 rounds of .40 caliber ammunition and a 9mm magazine.
But that's not all.
The thing that stuck out on that black Jeep was an orange fingernail in the front passenger floorboard of the vehicle.
So now detectives start to wonder, could this belong to the female who stole the vehicle?
Was she also the woman that called Armani just a few moments before he was shot?
So, is you coming outside?
Armed with this new evidence, detectives have a lot of questions for the driver of the stolen Jeep, Robert Holland.
I was able to return to our Special Operations Homicide Unit where I knew that Robert Holland was already seated in an interview room and waiting to be interviewed. Very first thing that stuck out to me about Robert Holland was the very bright red pants that he was wearing.
Cool talk with us, so we can talk about why you're here.
Yeah, I want to know why I'm here. Yeah, I'm cool with talking to you about why I'm here.
Right off the bat, Robert denies everything, the shooting and the car chase. Robert insists that he was just in town visiting one of his cousins.
Mostly, when I come up here, I just be chilling, like getting away from my little brothers and sisters, you know, just chilling.
He even says he was not even in the getaway car. He was just at the wrong place at the wrong time.
I never even rode in the car to me. I don't know nothing about no shooting.
Robert Holland's initial story was that he was just walking to the local convenience store to purchase Black & Mild, and the police started chasing him.
Yeah, I seen police running through the field. Naturally, I just got scared, really, and went crazy.
Robert also has an explanation for the black ski mask he was wearing when he was arrested.
You put a ski mask on
Yeah, it's really for my asthma, though. It's even because I don't be breathing cold weather.
The detectives don't buy his story for 1 second.
You have to push through the lie, and a provable lie is something that's paramount in any interrogation. So it was easy to prove that you were driving a vehicle because 2 law enforcement officers saw you jump out of a vehicle with bright red pants on, ran after you for less than a minute.
You're wearing bright red pants, man. Like, that's the worst pants to wear when you're going to try to run from the police.
Investigators are certain that Robert is guilty. But who is his accomplice?
The other individual who fled from the scene is still nowhere to be found.
And detectives are no closer to getting that information from Robert. After a high-speed chase through the streets of Clarksville, Tennessee, police have a suspect in the murder of 17-year-old Armani Majors, a fellow teenager named Robert Holland. But Robert is refusing to play ball.
You were driving a car that was stolen and fled from the scene of a murder. You did that. Listen, no, you did.
Robert wasn't the only suspect inside the getaway car that night, but he refuses to give investigators any information on his accomplice.
Once it's clear that the officers are not going to get anything else out of Robert, they end the interview.
But they keep Robert in custody as they continue to work the case.
Several questions still remain here. Who was the other individual inside the car, and why did they want Armani dead?
Fortunately, the forensics team is able to crack the code to Armani's cell phone.
I could see an Instagram profile that he had been chatting with. And I took note of the name Barbie Doll Mir.
Could this be the same Barbie that stole the getaway car?
They were using vanishing mode on the app, which means their messages disappear automatically after they were read.
Still, Detective Hughes could see that Barbie doll Mir was the last person Armani was in contact with.
Barbie doll Mir video called Armani minutes before he was killed.
And immediately after the shooting, she changed her profile name.
Barbie doll Mir changed her username to Mir2Shiesty and blocked Armani's account. To the detectives, this type of behavior was highly suspicious.
So in trying to figure out who this young woman was, investigators took note of the fact that both usernames included the letters M-I-R.
A lot of folks in their usernames have some vestige of their actual name in it if they don't use their full name already. Miracle was the name that another investigator thought off the top of their head that would start with Mir. And it was a simple narrowing down of a likely age range.
When searching their criminal database, one name stands out from the rest. 18-year-old Miracle Bailey.
Miracle actually had a gun charge from a few weeks prior.
Police waste no time reaching out to their new suspect.
I had sent detectives out to her home, and she consented to come down to the police station for an interview.
Miss Miracle? Yes, sir. Need water or anything?
As Detective Hughes sits down with Miracle, there's something about her appearance that immediately jumps out to him.
During my time interviewing Miracle Bailey, I had made note of her orange fingernails, of which she was missing 3 or 4.
They're the same type of acrylic orange fingernails as the one police found in Robert Holland's stolen getaway car.
The fact that it was in the floorboard of the front passenger seat gave more credence to the fact that she was in that vehicle.
You're aware that we're investigating the shooting, I guess. Is that right?
Yes. In the interview room, Miracle tells detectives that she's already aware of the shooting that took place.
She says her sister is the one that told her the tragic news.
My sister texted me and was like, K7 got shot. She was like, yeah, he died. And I'm like, what?
So, you said K7?
Mm-hmm.
K7 was a nickname that Armani sometimes went by.
Miracle tells Detective Hughes she and Armani were once high school sweethearts.
How long did y'all date?
We was on and off for 4 years.
But according to Miracle, they finally called it quits for good a few months ago.
We just broke up because he was cheating on me, whatever. Like, he had a lot of girlfriends.
Regardless, Miracle says the two of them remained friends.
We just started being cool. We were cool. We wasn't dating no more.
She suggests that one of Armani's other ex-girlfriends may be to blame for his death.
Miracle shares that what's going around on social media is that Armani was killed by his ex-girlfriend and her new boyfriend.
Her boyfriend posted man down on Instagram.
You know her name?
No, I don't know her at all. She posted like right after. She posted a video of her and some dudes in the back of the seat. And he had the gun. He was like flashing the gun in the video.
And you saw the video yourself?
Yeah, I seen it.
However, Miracle isn't able to provide any proof that this video exists.
Detectives begin to pick apart her story.
They asked Miracle why did she change her Instagram username right after the shooting.
She maintained that it was not an irregular thing for her to do to change her Instagram profile name.
I'm always with my Instagram username.
But Miracle denies ever blocking Armani.
She says a lot of people have the password to her account and could have done it.
Detectives then share with Miracle that they are fully aware that she was the one who was video chatting with Armani around the time he was killed.
Hey.
Hey. You coming outside?
Miracle is like, so what?
I told him goodnight when he hung up. I didn't hear no gunshots, no nothing.
But detectives still aren't buying Miracle's version of events.
Detectives begin to dial up the pressure on Miracle, and she starts to change her story.
that led to some truth coming out in that interview.
Still wouldn't have it. No.
Like what?
She admits that she knows at least one person who would want to hurt Armani.
K7 had gotten pregnant with her. And he hated K7's gut. He hated his gut.
Hours after 17-year-old Armani Majors was gunned down in Clarksville, Tennessee, detectives are speaking with his ex-girlfriend, Miracle Bailey.
Miracle denies having anything to do with Armani's murder.
But she admits she does know someone who had a grudge against him.
Because there's only one person I know. Like, but I don't think yeah.
Who?
He was my, I was saying he my boyfriend, but he's not my boyfriend. And he hated, because K7 had gotten pregnant with her. And he hated K7's gut. He hated his gut.
Miracle's new man is no stranger to police.
What's his name?
They call him Little Rob.
Little Rob, as in Robert Holland.
She confirmed that Robert Holland went by that name and that he was her boyfriend. And that obviously was what connected these two individuals together.
According to Miracle, when Robert found out she had gotten pregnant by Armani, he was furious.
Did you have a baby?
I had a miscarriage. And
So Lil Rob hated him for that?
Lil Rob hated him, period.
And when Robert learned Miracle was still maintaining a friendship with Armani, even after her miscarriage, it only fueled his anger.
The thing about Lil Rob, you know, it's like you really don't want to get on his bad side. Like, something wrong with him.
But investigators think Miracle is more involved in what happened to Armani than she's letting on.
I'm not talking to somebody because now's the time for the complete truth.
Finally, Miracle caves to the pressure.
Okay, this is how he did come to me, but it was right now. We went to Wendy's.
While she and Robert were out, Miracle says she got a text from Armani.
Is that him? You texted him in my face.
Robert was furious and thought that Armani was trying to make moves on his girl.
When I seen it, he got mad at me, started arguing. He was like, you with the all that, you know, don't, we had a big argument.
You know I don't even like this dude, bro.
Just take me home, okay? Take me home.
All right, say that. We out.
I told him tell me off. He did.
According to Miracle, after she got home, Robert called her.
What do you want?
He told me to call K7.
And tell him what?
And tell him that I'm gonna be on the way. And I was like, what? I was asking him, what you number on the way? He was like, man, do what I say.
Miracle had claimed being on the phone with Robert Holland that Robert Holland's intent was to go sell him some gas, as she referred to it, which is known to be bad or fake marijuana.
I was like, what y'all on? He was like, it's cool, we squashed it. You want some gas? I'm gonna serve him.
Miracle says that she thought Robert was just going to go there to finesse Armani out of his money by selling him fake drugs. She says she never thought that he was actually going to kill him.
He knew he wasn't with someone both, man. They hate each other.
No, but listen, I've never seen it happen before. And you can probably think I'm lying, y'all lied in the past, but I'm honestly giving y'all the whole truth right now.
Miracle admits that she did lure Armani outside. but she claims Rob made her do it.
He told me to tell him when I saw him. Told me to do it.
Where were you at?
I was at home.
After sending some messages back and forth with Armani over Instagram, Miracle made the video call to him.
Hey.
So, is you coming outside?
Hold on. Hey, I'll be right back, okay?
Okay.
Hey, I'm coming out now.
All right, I see.
But after hanging up with Armani, Miracle says she got a bad feeling.
She couldn't get a hold of Robert for the next several minutes.
I just felt something was right. Then he wasn't not calling back. I didn't know that he was setting him up there. I promise you, I didn't know.
However, Miracle admits she stole the car that Robert drove on the night of the murder.
Tell me the circumstances behind you taking that guy's car.
Okay, so we was at a hotel and we drinking and stuff.
How'd you meet him?
On Facebook.
At a particular point, she felt uncomfortable.
You wanted to do what?
He wanted to
Have sex?
yeah. And I was like, I didn't smoke a shit with you,
So Miracle devised a plan.
So as he in the shower, I'm like, okay, what I gotta do, I just have to get the keys.
So while he was in the shower, you got to get up and...
Her response to that situation was to take the vehicle and leave from the hotel.
After wrapping up their interview, detectives begin digging deeper into Miracle's story.
Through forensic examination of her cell phone and her social media accounts, we were able to recover messages that were sent between the victim and Miracle Bailey.
Once Instagram came back and was able to produce the vanish mode messages, it shows in order how she had basically set the plan to have him ambushed.
She is actively trying to lure Armani out of his home where he is safe and direct him to the spot where he is subsequently shot and killed.
In the DMs, Miracle is insistent that Armani be alone.
In the messages, it is very clear that Miracle wants Armani to come outside alone, and she says this several times.
GPS data also confirms Miracle's culpability, putting her at the scene of the crime.
We were able to mirror GPS coordinates recovered from Miracle Bailey's phone with the vehicle pursuit itself.
GPS data shows Miracle in the getaway car as Robert sped away from the scene of the shooting.
Her phone, being the GPS tracker, allowed us to literally see the foot pursuit where Robert Holland was taken into place.
Hold it right there, boy. Put your hands up.
On December 13th, 2021, investigators charged the couple with Armani's murder.
Robert Holland and Miracle Bailey are both charged with first-degree murder.
And as the trial draws near, prosecutors get a helping hand from the last person they expect, Robert Holland himself.
When he made a phone call from the jail, Rod basically confessed the murder.
Clarksville, Tennessee. Teenagers Robert Holland and Miracle Bailey are facing charges in the murder of Miracle's ex-boyfriend, Armani Majors.
What set this case apart for me was that the victim was 17 years old and that the suspects were 18. You can tell that this was an act of rage.
During a recorded jailhouse phone call with his mother, Robert is angry and upset after learning that Miracle implicated him in her police interview.
What you think you did, Robert?
He had to run,
To prosecutors, this statement is a confession because he didn't say that Miracle lied on him. Instead, he said that she snitched.
On January 22nd, 2024, Miracle and Robert go on trial together.
When they kicked off the opening arguments, the district attorney, he said this was an ambush. point blank.
The state starts by methodically laying out all the forensic cell phone evidence, including the Instagram video chat.
Through DMs and video calls, Miracle used lies and manipulation to lure Armani outside to see her.
The last message that we have is from Barbie doll Mir saying, "Walk up."
According to the state, the evidence clearly shows Miracle lured Armani into a trap.
She was actively trying to get Armani alone, so there would be no witnesses and no one to help him.
The persistence of Miracle Bailey in those messages made it very clear that without her, Armani wouldn't have left that house.
Hey. You coming outside?
Hold on. Hey, I'll be right back, okay?
Okay, honey.
Hey, I'm finna come out now.
Okay.
He genuinely thought he was going outside to talk to his ex-girlfriend.
Armani was just a 17-year-old kid. You get a message from a pretty girl saying, "Hey, let's meet up, just the two of us." No teenage boy is going to turn that down.
According to prosecutors, ballistics evidence proved it was Robert Holland who ambushed Armani, shooting him 14 times.
I don't think he even saw Robert until it was too late.
Robert Holland's gunshot residue tests come back positive, proving that he was near a firing gun the night of the homicide.
Also, the shell casings came back to the firearm that was recovered from Robert Holland's path of flight.
Robert Holland, he was the one that pulled the trigger. There was just no disputing it.
But why did the couple kill Armani in the first place? Their motive is still unclear.
Police didn't feel like they got the full truth from either suspect.
Just like there's no perfect person, there is no perfect case.
But going off of Miracle's statement, it's possible the motive was pure jealousy. Robert was furious when he found out that Miracle was still in contact with Armani, and together they devised a plan to lure him to his death.
Regardless of how somebody came to be murdered, especially somebody as young as Armani, there's no reason for it at any time. There's no reason to lure an individual out of the safety of their home and in their life just because he talked to somebody at the wrong time.
We'll never know why Miracle went along with it. Only she knows that. But there's no question in the minds of prosecutors that she was just as involved in this murder plot as Robert.
After a 5-day trial, the case goes to the jury.
The jurors only took 3 hours to deliberate, and it was clear who they believed.
They found the defendants guilty of all charges, including first-degree murder, evading an arrest, and joyriding.
They both end up being sentenced to life.
Robert Holland just kind of stared blankly, just really staring at the table, not really moving. Miracle Bailey broke down crying. And likewise, the family of the defendants, they were definitely inconsolable.
High emotions spill out into the hallway outside the courtroom.
There is shouting and screaming. There is pushing. There is court officers diving into the mix, trying to pull people away. And I can distinctly remember hearing one woman screaming, "Burn in hell, burn in hell." And another woman screamed, "Your son and daughter put my brother in the ground."
2 life sentences does not bring back a beautiful smile and a funny young man with his whole future ahead of him. But it certainly is the least that we can do in any death investigation and any homicide, is to do everything we can as investigators to afford the justice that that individual deserves. His family certainly did love and they miss him every single day.
January 15th, Sill, 1980, Gresham, Oregon. A 19-year-old college student named Barbara Mae Tucker was on the campus of Mount Hood Community College, surrounded by the ordinary sounds of an evening that should have ended like any other. Students were coming and going. Cars moved along the roads outside the campus. Classes were underway. Nothing about the scene suggested that before the night was over, Barbara would become the victim of a murder that would remain unsolved for more than 4 decades. Barbara was young, a business student with a life still ahead of her. She had family, friends, responsibilities, and plans. Then, sometime that evening, those plans were violently destroyed. Witnesses later reported seeing Barbara near Northeast Kane Drive. What happened next would become one of the most disturbing elements of the case. Barbara appeared to be in distress. She was seen near the roadway, and investigators would later learn that she had apparently been trying to attract the attention of passing motorists. One witness described seeing a young woman with blood and mud on her face. Another reported seeing a man near her emerging from the direction of nearby shrubs. To anyone passing through the area, the scene may have lasted only moments. But those moments would become critical. Barbara was not simply walking home. Something was wrong. Something had already happened to her, and somewhere in the darkness was the person responsible. The witnesses could not know that they were seeing fragments of a crime that would eventually become one of Gresham's most enduring cold cases. Barbara disappeared from the roadway. By the following morning, the horror was discovered. Her body was found in a wooded area near a campus parking lot. The campus that had been filled with students and ordinary activity was suddenly a crime scene. Investigators began working to reconstruct the final hours of Barbara's life. She had been kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and beaten to death. The violence of the crime immediately raised the most important question. Who had done this? Detectives had a location. They had a victim. They had witnesses who had seen pieces of the encounter. But what they did not have was a name. The investigation began with the painstaking process of identifying Barbara's movements and determining who might have been around her during those critical hours. Every observation mattered. Every witness statement mattered. Every piece of physical evidence mattered. But 1980 was a different era of forensic investigation. The technology available to detectives could not extract the same information that modern laboratories can obtain from biological evidence. DNA profiling as investigators know it today did not yet exist as a practical tool in criminal investigations. There was no national database capable of instantly comparing an unknown biological profile against millions of records. There was no genetic genealogy. There were no commercial ancestry databases capable of helping investigators construct distant family trees from an unidentified DNA sample. The case had to be solved using the methods of its time. Detectives followed lead. Witnesses were questioned. The circumstances surrounding Barbara's final hours were examined. Yet no suspect emerged who could be conclusively tied to the murder. As the weeks became months and the months became years, the case gradually moved away from the headlines. The urgency that surrounds a new homicide began to fade. Other crimes demanded attention. Investigators changed. Memories became older. People moved. Records accumulated. But Barbara remained dead, and her killer remained unidentified. For her family, time did not make the crime disappear. The absence of an answer became part of their lives. There was no courtroom, no conviction, no sentence, no explanation for why Barbara had been targeted or who had taken her life. The case became a cold case, but the evidence did not necessarily become useless. Some of the most important evidence had been preserved during the original investigation. Biological material collected during Barbara's autopsy would eventually become the bridge between 1980 and the future. 2 decades after the murder, investigators submitted vaginal swabs to the Oregon State Police Crime Laboratory. In 2000, scientists were able to develop a DNA profile from the evidence. It was a major breakthrough, but it did not immediately solve the case. The DNA profile belonged to an unknown male. There was no immediate identification. The profile could tell investigators that a particular person had contributed the biological material, but it could not tell them his name. The unknown profile became a silent witness. It carried information, but investigators still needed a way to connect that information to an actual person. For years, the profile remained unmatched, and that meant Barbara's killer remained free. More years passed. Then forensic science began changing the way cold cases were investigated. DNA databases expanded. Laboratory techniques became more sensitive. Investigators learned that an unknown suspect did not necessarily have to appear directly in a criminal database for his relatives to provide a path toward him. Genetic genealogy introduced a new possibility. Investigators could take an unidentified DNA profile and, under appropriate circumstances, compare it with genetic information available through genealogy databases. Instead of searching only for the suspect himself, investigators could look for biological relatives. Those relatives could provide branches of a family tree. The branches could narrow. Generations could be reconstructed. Eventually, the unknown person could become identifiable. Barbara's case entered this new era. More than 40 years after her death, investigators revisited the evidence with techniques that simply had not existed when Barbara was killed. The old DNA profile suddenly had a new potential. It could be analyzed in ways that investigators in 1980 could never have imagined. The search eventually pointed toward Robert Arthur Plimpton. He was not a name publicly associated with the case for most of its history. For decades, there had been no arrest connected to Barbara's murder. Now investigators had a person whose DNA could potentially answer the question that had remained unanswered since that winter night. But a genealogy lead was not enough. Investigators needed direct confirmation. They needed evidence that could stand in court. They began surveillance. Plimpton was observed. Investigators looked for an opportunity to obtain DNA without alerting him to the investigation. Then came an apparently insignificant moment. Plimpton discarded a piece of chewing gum. To anyone else, it was garbage. To investigators, it was evidence. The gum was recovered and submitted to the Oregon State Police Crime Laboratory. Scientists tested the DNA found on it. The result was decisive. The DNA profile matched the biological evidence recovered from Barbara Tucker's case. After more than 40 years, the unknown genetic signature finally had a name: Robert Arthur Plimpton. On June 8, SIL 2021, he was arrested and charged in connection with Barbara's murder. The announcement sent shock waves through the community. A case that had been dormant for decades was suddenly alive again. The investigation had crossed an extraordinary distance in time. The original detectives who had worked the case in 1980 had been forced to operate without DNA profiling. The investigators decades later had something those detectives could never have possessed: technology capable of turning preserved biological evidence into a direct investigative lead. Yet an arrest was not the end. It was the beginning of another battle for the truth. The prosecution would have to demonstrate that the DNA evidence was reliable. Witness accounts from 1980 would have to be examined. The defense would have the opportunity to challenge the evidence, and the court would have to determine whether the decades-old mystery had finally been solved beyond a reasonable doubt. Barbara's family had waited more than 40 years for that moment. 40 years is long enough for children to become adults, for adults to become elderly, for entire generations to grow up knowing a murder only as a story from the past. But for the people who loved Barbara, January 15th, SIL 1980, never truly became the past. Her absence remained permanent. Her killer remained unidentified. Then science reached backward through the decades and found what investigators had been unable to find in the darkness of that original night. The evidence had survived. The DNA had survived, and the truth contained within it had waited patiently for technology to become capable of reading it. The case that once seemed destined to remain an unanswered mystery had finally produced a suspect. But before a courtroom could deliver a verdict, investigators still had to confront the most difficult question of all. What exactly happened to Barbara Tucker during those final hours, and how had her killer managed to disappear for so long? The answers were buried inside a crime scene that had been examined more than 40 years earlier, inside memories preserved by witnesses, and inside biological evidence that had outlasted the decade. The night of January 15th, SIL 1980 had ended Barbara's life. It had not ended the investigation for 41 years. The case waited. Then, almost impossibly, the past came back. The first hours after Barbara May Tucker's body was discovered were filled with the kind of confusion that surrounds every major crime scene. But there was one fact investigators understood immediately. This was not an accident, and Barbara had not simply wandered into the wooded area and died. She had been attacked. Her death was violent. The 19-year-old college student had been kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and beaten, and the location where her body was found became the center of an investigation that would eventually span generations. On the campus of Mount Hood Community College, investigators began reconstructing the final movements of a young woman whose life had ended only hours earlier. Every pathway, every nearby road, every parking area, and every possible route between the campus and Northeast Kane Drive suddenly mattered. The investigation was not beginning with a clear picture of the killer, it was beginning with fragments. A witness had seen Barbara near the roadway. Another had noticed what appeared to be a man close to her. There were reports suggesting Barbara was attempting to get help. These observations were disturbing because they indicated that, during the final moments when she was still alive, Barbara may have been trying to communicate that she was in danger. Yet the witnesses had seen the scene only briefly under circumstances that were far from ideal. There was no controlled interview conducted at the instant the event occurred. No high-definition surveillance camera had captured the encounter. No digital location data could place every person around the campus. Investigators had to depend on human memory and physical evidence, and both could be frustratingly incomplete. The man seen near Barbara became an especially important question. Who was he? Was he the person who had attacked her? Had anyone else seen him before or after the encounter? How had Barbara ended up in the wooded area where her body was found? And how had the attacker managed to leave the scene without being identified? These questions drove the early investigation. Detectives interviewed people who might have seen Barbara that evening. They worked through the timeline. They examined the crime scene and collected evidence. They looked for connections between the victim and anyone who might have had a reason to harm her. But a murder investigation does not always produce answers simply because detectives ask the right questions. Sometimes the evidence points in several directions at once. Sometimes witnesses remember only isolated details. Sometimes investigators know exactly what they need but lack the technology to recover it. Barbara's case contained all three problems. The physical evidence could tell investigators important things about the crime, but the forensic science of 1980 had strict limits. DNA profiling had not yet become the revolutionary investigative tool it would later become. The biological evidence collected from Barbara could be preserved, but preservation was not the same thing as identification. The evidence could sit in an evidence room, carefully documented and protected, without revealing the name of the person who had left it behind. That distinction would become critical decades later. In the aftermath of Barbara's murder, investigators had to pursue more traditional avenues. They considered people who might have known Barbara. They examined possible witnesses. They followed leads that appeared promising and then watched some of them disappear. The investigation was active, but the identity of the killer remained hidden. There was no immediate suspect whose connection to the crime could withstand scrutiny. No confession arrived. No eyewitness could provide the kind of definitive identification investigators needed, and without a clear suspect, the case began moving into the most dangerous phase of any unsolved homicide. Time. Time changes everything. Buildings are demolished or renovated. People relocate. Witnesses forget details. Relationships disappear. Records become harder to locate. Investigators retire. The original urgency becomes history. Yet the family of a murder victim does not experience time in the same way. For Barbara's loved ones, the date of her death remained fixed. January 15th. 1980 did not become less painful simply because the calendar moved forward. Every year added another layer of distance between the crime and the possibility of an arrest. The community also carried the unanswered question. A killer had committed a brutal crime near a college campus and had not been identified. For people who lived in the area, the absence of an answer could create a lingering unease. The case became part of local memory. A crime remembered not because there had been a spectacular courtroom ending, but because there had not been one at all. Then, years later, science provided the investigation with something new. In 2000, investigators submitted vaginal swabs from Barbara Ray's autopsy to the Oregon State Police Crime Laboratory. Scientists were able to develop a DNA profile from the biological material. For the first time, investigators possessed something far more precise than a general description of an unknown attacker. They had a genetic profile. It was potentially unique to one person, but the breakthrough came with a devastating limitation. The profile did not immediately identify anyone. The DNA belonged to an unknown male, and investigators had no matching record that could reveal his identity. The profile could tell them that the biological evidence came from one particular man. It could not tell them where he lived, what he looked like, what name he used, or whether he was still alive. The case had moved forward scientifically while remaining stalled investigatively. It was as though investigators had finally found a fingerprint, had no database containing the fingerprint's owner. The DNA was there. The answer was there. But the connection between them was missing. That connection would take another 20 years to emerge. During those decades, the technology surrounding forensic DNA changed dramatically. Law enforcement databases expanded. Private genealogy databases grew. Genetic genealogy became increasingly significant in investigations of unidentified remains and long unsolved homicides. The fundamental idea was simple but powerful. People inherit DNA from relatives. An unknown suspect's genetic profile might therefore contain clues about his family, even if the suspect himself had never entered a law enforcement database. Investigators could potentially use relatives to construct family trees, eliminate branches, and eventually narrow the search toward one individual. It was not a shortcut. It required careful analysis, genealogical research, corroboration, and ultimately direct forensic testing. But for a case like Barbara Reyes, it opened a door that had been locked for decades. Investigators revisited the old evidence. The DNA profile created in 2000 was no longer merely an unidentified genetic signature. It became a potential starting point for a genealogical investigation. Researchers began tracing possible family relationships connected to the unknown DNA. The investigation eventually led toward Robert Arthur Plimpton. Suddenly, the case had something it had lacked since 1980, a specific person who could be tested. But detectives still had to prove that the genetic lead was more than a statistical or genealogical possibility. They needed Plimpton's DNA. They needed a direct comparison with the biological evidence preserved from Barbara Reyes' case. That meant surveillance and patience. Investigators observed Plimpton and waited for an opportunity to recover something he had discarded. Eventually, they saw him discard chewing gum. The gum was collected and sent to the Oregon State Police Crime Laboratory. Under ordinary circumstances, a discarded piece of chewing gum would be meaningless. In a cold case investigation, it could become the final bridge between suspicion and evidence. Scientists compared the DNA recovered from the gum with the DNA profile developed from the evidence associated with Barbara Reyes' murder. The result was the moment investigators had spent decades waiting for. The profiles matched. The unknown male whose biological evidence had been preserved from Barbara Tucker's case was identified as Robert Arthur Plimpton. After more than 40 years, the investigation finally had a direct forensic connection between a living suspect and evidence from the 1980 murder. On June 8, 2021, Plimpton was arrested. The case that had spent decades in the category of unsolved homicide suddenly returned to the center of public attention. For investigators, the arrest represented an extraordinary transition. The evidence collected in an investigation from another era had survived long enough to be analyzed with technologies that did not exist when Barbara was alive. For Barbara Reyes' family, however, the news was far more complicated. An arrest could bring hope, but it could also reopen wounds that had never completely healed. The name of the accused man now appeared alongside Barbara Reyes' name in a case that had remained unresolved for most of their lives. The family had waited for an answer, but an answer does not erase grief. It does not restore the person who was taken. It does not return the years that passed without justice. It simply changes the question. For decades, the question had been, who killed Barbara Tucker? Now investigators, prosecutors, and Barbara Reyes, loved ones were confronting a different question. Could the evidence finally prove it in court? The prosecution would have to take a murder that occurred in 1980 and present it to a courtroom more than 4 decades later. Witness memories had to be evaluated. DNA evidence had to be explained. The circumstances surrounding Barbara Ray's final hours had to be reconstructed. And the defense would have its own opportunity to challenge the prosecution's case. The long silence had ended, but the legal process was only beginning. Somewhere between the original crime scene and the modern laboratory, between witness memories and genetic genealogy, the case had transformed from an unanswered mystery into a prosecution. And at the center of it all was the same 19-year-old woman whose final hours had started the investigation in the first place. Barbara Tucker had been gone since 1980, but the evidence connected to her had never truly disappeared. It had waited through the years, through changing investigators and changing technology, until the science became powerful enough to reveal what it had been carrying all along. The killer could disappear. Memories could fade. Decades could pass, but the biological evidence remained. And now, for the first time, that evidence had a name. By the time investigators had identified Robert Arthur Plimpton through genetic genealogy and confirmed the connection with DNA recovered from discarded chewing gum, the Barbara Tucker case was no longer simply a cold file sitting in an archive. It had become an active homicide investigation again, and that meant detectives had to travel backward through more than 4 decades of history, reconstructing a crime that had taken place when the world was very different and when many of the people connected to it were decades younger. The arrest in June 2021 was the dramatic moment the public saw. But behind that moment was a long process of testing, comparison, documentation, and verification. Investigators could not afford to treat a genealogical lead as a final answer. They needed evidence that could survive scrutiny. The biological material connected to Barbara Ray's murder had already produced a DNA profile in 2000. That profile had remained unidentified for years. When modern genetic genealogy eventually pointed investigators toward Plimpton, the direct comparison became the crucial step. The DNA recovered from the chewing gum was not simply an investigative theory. Laboratory testing linked it to the profile developed from evidence associated with Barbara Ray's murder. After 41 years, the unknown biological signature had been given a name. But the passage of time created another problem. A case from 1980 could not be presented as though it had happened yesterday. Investigators had to determine what witnesses remembered, what records remained, what physical evidence had survived, and how all of those pieces fit together. Every old statement had to be examined with care. Memories are not recordings. They change. Details can become blurred. People can remember the emotion of an event more clearly than the precise sequence of what they saw. Yet even decades-old observations can become important when they are combined with independent evidence. In Barbara Ray's case, witnesses had reported seeing her near Northeast Kane Drive during the evening of January 15, SIL 1980. The significance of those observations became clearer when investigators looked at them alongside the physical evidence and later DNA results. Barbara had apparently been in distress. She had been seen in an area where passing motorists could potentially see her. Her condition suggested that something terrible had already happened before she was found. Those early observations formed part of the narrative investigators would eventually present to prosecutors. But the central question remained: how could a court establish what happened more than 40 years earlier? The answer depended on the strength of the evidence rather than the age of the case. DNA does not become less genetically accurate simply because decades have passed, provided the biological material has been preserved adequately and the testing is reliable. That was one of the reasons Barbara Ray's case could survive for so long. The physical evidence had remained available even when the identity of the person connected to it was unknown. In the years before modern genetic genealogy, investigators could do little more than preserve the profile and wait for a potential match. Once new investigative methods became available, the old evidence could be revisited. This is what makes a cold case so different from a forgotten case. A cold case may be inactive, but it is not necessarily dead. Evidence can remain. Records can remain. Questions can remain. And sometimes technology changes the meaning of evidence that investigators already possess. The identification of Plimpton reopened the entire history of Barbara Ray's murder. Prosecutors had to determine what charges were appropriate and how the evidence would be presented. Plimpton faced a first-degree murder charge. The allegation was now specific, that he was responsible for the death of Barbara Tucker. But an allegation is not a conviction. The courtroom would become the place where the decades-old evidence had to withstand adversarial testing. For Barbara Ray's family, the legal process carried an emotional weight that could not be measured by laboratory reports. They had lived with the absence of an answer for most of their lives. When the arrest finally came, the case was suddenly everywhere again. The name Barbara Tucker was connected to news reports, court proceedings, and public discussion. Her photograph and her story returned to the public record. Yet behind every headline was the same reality. Barbara had been 19 years old when she was killed. She never had the opportunity to grow older. She never experienced the decades that followed. Her family did. They lived through birthdays, holidays, marriages, careers, losses, and ordinary days without her. The arrest could not change that. It could only create the possibility that the person accused of taking her life might finally be held accountable. The prosecution's case depended heavily on the forensic evidence. DNA had become the bridge between the original investigation and the modern prosecution. The biological material from Barbara Ray's case had produced a profile in 2000. The later DNA sample from Plimpton provided the direct comparison. This sequence was critical because it showed how the investigation evolved. First came the crime. Then came the collection and preservation of evidence. Then, years later, the creation of a DNA profile. Then decades of uncertainty. Finally, genetic genealogy generated a potential suspect, and direct DNA testing provided the confirmation. The case demonstrated the difference between identifying an unknown DNA profile and proving whose DNA it is. One step created a profile, another created a lead. A final comparison established the connection prosecutors could take into court. The legal challenge was to explain that process clearly and establish that the evidence had been properly collected, preserved, analyzed, and interpreted. At the same time, prosecutors had to place the DNA evidence within the larger story of Barbara Ray's death. DNA alone could identify a biological contributor, but the court also needed to consider how that evidence related to the crime. The location, witness accounts, circumstances of Barbara Ray's disappearance, and condition when she was found all formed part of the larger evidentiary picture. The defense, meanwhile, had the right to challenge the prosecution's interpretation and the reliability of the evidence. That is the nature of a criminal trial. Even in a case with powerful forensic evidence, the government must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The passage of time could not lower that standard. If anything, the age of the case made careful examination even more important. Witnesses had to remember events from an era before smartphones, before modern surveillance networks, and before the explosion of forensic databases. The investigators who worked on the original case were part of a different generation of police. The detectives who later reopened it operated in an entirely different technological environment. Their task was to connect those two worlds without losing the integrity of the evidence. As the prosecution prepared its case, the story of Barbara Ray's final evening became more than a sequence of old witness statements. It became a timeline. Barbara was on the Mount Hood Community College campus. She was later seen near Northeast Kane Drive. Witnesses observed signs that she was in trouble. She was ultimately found dead near the campus. Somewhere within that sequence, the attacker had gained control of her, assaulted her, and killed her. The DNA evidence connected Plimpton to biological material recovered in the investigation. The question for the court was whether the entire body of evidence established his guilt. Outside the courtroom, the case also raised a larger question about the power of modern forensic science. How many old crimes still contain evidence capable of revealing the truth? How many unidentified offenders could theoretically be found through genetic genealogy? And how many families have spent decades waiting for an answer because the technology needed to provide it did not yet exist? Barbara Ray's case illustrated both the promise and the limitations of that approach. Genetic genealogy did not magically solve the murder. It created an investigative pathway. Investigators still had to conduct surveillance, obtain a comparison sample, perform laboratory testing, and build a prosecutable case. The science opened the door. Traditional police work still had to walk through it. By the time the case reached court, the story had crossed more than 40 years. The 19-year-old student who had been murdered in 1980 was now at the center of a legal proceeding involving forensic technology that would have seemed impossible at the time of her death. And the man accused of killing her was no longer an unknown figure hidden behind an unidentified DNA profile. He had a name. He had been arrested. He was facing the consequences of a crime that had remained unresolved through most of his adult life. But the trial would determine whether the evidence was enough to transform that accusation into a conviction. The courtroom would force the past into the present. Old memories would meet modern science. A preserved biological sample would meet a contemporary DNA laboratory. And the family of Barbara Tucker would finally have the opportunity to hear the evidence presented publicly, not as an unsolved mystery, but as a case in which the state was asking a jury to determine who was responsible for the death of a 19-year-old woman whose life had been taken on a cold January night in Oregon. For decades, Barbara Ray's murder had been defined by one word: unknown. The suspect was unknown. The future of the case was unknown. The identity of the killer was unknown. Now that word was disappearing piece by piece. The investigation had found a name. The laboratory had found a match. The prosecution had a case, but the final decision would belong to the court, where the evidence from 1980 would be judged against the standards of 2024. The courtroom phase of the Barbara Tucker investigation began more than 40 years after the night that had shattered her family. By the time Robert Arthur Plimpton finally stood accused, the original crime had become a piece of Oregon history, a case that had survived investigators' changing technology and decades of silence. But the evidence had survived too. The DNA recovered from Barbara Ray's body had been turned into a profile in 2000, and that profile eventually became the key that unlocked the identity of the man investigators believed was responsible. In early 2021, a genealogist working with Parabon Nanolabs identified Plimpton as a likely contributor to the unknown DNA profile. Gresham detectives then located him living in Troutdale and began surveillance. They needed more than a genealogical prediction. They needed direct forensic confirmation. That opportunity came when detectives saw Plimpton spit chewing gum onto the ground. They collected it, sent it to the Oregon State Police Crime Laboratory, and waited for the laboratory comparison that could determine whether the man they had been watching was connected to the biological evidence preserved from Barbara Ray's 1980 murder. The result was a match. The DNA from the chewing gum matched the DNA profile developed from the vaginal swabs collected during Barbara Ray's autopsy. Suddenly, the unidentified genetic profile that had haunted the investigation for decades had a name: Robert Arthur Plimpton. On June 8th, SIL 2021, he was taken into custody and lodged at the Multnomah County Detention Center. The arrest transformed the case, but it did not erase the 41 years that had passed. Instead, it forced the past back into public view. Barbara Ray's murder was no longer simply an unsolved crime from 1980. It was now a criminal prosecution. The state would have to prove its case. And because this was not a jury trial, the evidence would ultimately be evaluated by a judge. The bench trial took place before Multnomah County Judge Amy Baggio beginning February 26th, SIL 2024. For prosecutors, the central challenge was to connect the scientific evidence to the circumstances surrounding Barbara Ray's death and demonstrate that the DNA match was not an isolated laboratory fact, but a critical piece of a much larger case. The prosecution could point to the original investigation, the circumstances of Barbara Ray's death, the biological evidence collected during the autopsy, the DNA profile developed in 2000, the genealogical work that identified Plimpton as a likely contributor, and finally, the direct DNA comparison obtained from the discarded chewing gum. It was an evidentiary chain stretching across more than 4 decades. Each link mattered. If one link failed, the prosecution's narrative could weaken. But if the links held together, the case would demonstrate something extraordinary. Evidence gathered in the final investigation of a 19-year-old woman in 1980 could still identify her killer decades later. The courtroom also forced everyone to confront the brutal reality behind the forensic evidence. Barbara had not simply died. According to the prosecution, she had been kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and beaten to death near a campus parking lot. Her body was discovered the next morning, January 16th. Sill, 1980, in a wooded area between Kane Road and a school parking lot. The location that had once been part of a normal college environment had become the setting of a homicide that would remain unresolved for decades. The passage of time could not soften the fact. It could only make the distance between the crime and the courtroom seem more extraordinary. When the trial began in 2024, Barbara had been gone for more than 4 decades. People who had been young when she was killed were now older. The original investigation belonged to another era. The technology that ultimately identified Plimpton had not existed when Barbara was alive, yet the courtroom was being asked to examine the case as carefully as if the crime had happened only yesterday. The scientific evidence became the heart of that examination. The DNA profile developed from Barbara Ray's evidence had existed since 2000. For years, it had been an unidentified profile. That distinction was crucial. Investigators had possessed the genetic evidence but had not known whose DNA it was. Genetic genealogy eventually supplied the investigative lead. Parabon Nanolabs helped identify Plimpton as a likely contributor, but the genealogical identification was not the final forensic conclusion. Detectives still obtained a separate DNA sample from Plimpton's discarded chewing gum, and the Oregon State Police Crime Laboratory compared that sample against the profile from Barbara Ray's case. The match provided the direct forensic connection. The case therefore represented 2 different eras of investigative science meeting inside one courtroom. The original investigators had preserved evidence without knowing exactly what it would one day reveal. Modern investigators had the tools to interpret that evidence in ways that would have been impossible in 1980. That was the power of the cold case. Time had not destroyed every answer. Some answers had simply been waiting for the right technology. But the prosecution could not rely on technology alone. The judge had to evaluate the totality of the evidence and determine whether the state had established Plimpton's guilt. The trial continued through March 15th, Sill, 2024. For Barbara Ray's family and friends, every day of the proceeding represented another confrontation with a history they had carried for decades. There is something uniquely painful about waiting 40 years for a trial. The people who loved the victim have already lived through the punishment of uncertainty. They have spent birthdays without her. They have marked anniversaries without answers. They have watched the world change while one question remained frozen in time. Who killed Barbara Tucker? Now, finally, that question was being answered in a courtroom. On March 15th, Judge Amy Baggio delivered the verdict. Robert Arthur Plimpton was found guilty of first-degree murder. The judge also found him guilty on 4 counts representing different theories of second-degree murder. The verdict ended the central uncertainty that had defined the case since 1980. The man investigators had identified through modern DNA techniques had now been convicted in court. For the community around Mount Hood Community College, the verdict represented the end of a case that had remained cold for more than 40 years. But for Barbara Ray's loved ones, the emotional reality was more complicated. Justice could arrive without healing every wound. A conviction could establish accountability without restoring the person who had been lost. The courtroom could deliver a verdict, but it could not give Barbara another birthday, another conversation, another ordinary evening, or another chance to continue the life that had been taken from her at 19. Still, the verdict mattered. It transformed the story of Barbara Tucker from an unsolved murder into a solved homicide with a conviction. The evidence that had once represented nothing more than an unidentified biological profile had become central to establishing responsibility. The discarded piece of chewing gum, an object that would normally disappear unnoticed, had become part of the chain that led investigators to the man convicted of killing her. It was almost impossible to imagine the contrast. In 1980, detectives had a murder scene and an unknown offender. In 2000, they had an unknown DNA profile. In 2021, genetic genealogy produced a potential identity. Then direct DNA testing confirmed the connection. And in 2024, a judge found Plimpton guilty. The sequence was not a single dramatic discovery. It was a chain of decisions made across generations. Evidence preserved by investigators in the past, Laboratory work performed years later, genealogical research using emerging technology, surveillance conducted by modern detectives, a discarded piece of gum, a laboratory comparison, and finally, a courtroom verdict. The investigation had moved slowly because history had moved slowly, but once the technology caught up, the case accelerated. The cold case had been broken open, yet there was still one final chapter waiting. A guilty verdict established responsibility, but the court still had to determine the punishment. On October 3rd, SIL 2024, Judge Kelly Skye sentenced Plimpton to life in prison with a minimum of 40 years to be served. He was immediately transferred into the custody of the Oregon Department of Corrections. The legal system had finally imposed a sentence for a murder committed more than 44 years earlier. The number was staggering, 44 years between the crime and the sentence, 44 years during which Barbara Reyes' family had lived without an answer, 44 years during which the killeress' identity had remained hidden from the public, and yet the evidence had remained. The case demonstrated something that investigators in 1980 could not have known. Sometimes the most important witness is not a person. Sometimes it is a piece of evidence capable of surviving longer than anyone expected. Barbara Tucker-Ress murder began as a crime that seemed destined to remain unresolved. The original investigation could not identify the killer. The DNA profile created in 2000 could not identify the killer for years. The case remained silent. Then science changed the question. Investigators no longer needed to ask only whether the killer was already in a database. They could ask whether his relatives might lead them to him. That change opened the door. The direct DNA comparison pushed it wider. The courtroom finally walked through it, and after decades of uncertainty, the case had reached a conclusion. Barbara Tucker was 19 years old when she was killed. Robert Plimpton was 60 when the guilty verdict was delivered in 2024. Between those two ages stood more than 4 decades of history. But in the courtroom, the years collapsed. The evidence from 1980 was still speaking. The DNA from Barbara Reyes' body still pointed toward the same genetic identity. The laboratory results still connected that identity to Plimpton, and the judge ultimately found the evidence sufficient to convict him. The mystery that had haunted Gresham for decades was no longer a mystery. The cold case had finally been solved, not because someone suddenly confessed, not because a forgotten witness appeared with a perfect memory, but because evidence that had been collected more than 40 years earlier was preserved long enough for modern science to understand it. The killer had been hidden by time, but time had also preserved the evidence that eventually exposed him. For more than 4 decades, Barbara Tucker-Ress murder existed in the space between memory and evidence. The crime had happened in 1980, but the answer did not arrive until a completely different era, when forensic science had developed tools capable of extracting information from evidence that investigators once could only preserve. That transformation is what made Barbara Reyes' case so remarkable. The most important breakthrough was not a dramatic confession or a witness suddenly appearing at a police station. It was the survival of biological evidence. Evidence collected after Barbara Reyes' death remained available long enough to be tested with modern DNA technology, and that single fact changed the trajectory of the investigation. In the early years of the case, investigators had to work without the technology that would later become central to the prosecution. There was no modern DNA database capable of automatically searching an unknown profile against millions of known offenders. There was no genetic genealogy capable of building a family tree from an unidentified suspect. Investigators had to rely on witness statements, physical evidence, interviews, and traditional detective work. Those methods were essential, but they could not produce the identification the case needed. The biological evidence connected to Barbara Reyes' murder therefore remained something of a locked door. Investigators knew there was information inside it, but they lacked the key. In 2000, that began to change. The vaginal swabs collected during Barbara Reyes' autopsy were submitted to the Oregon State Police Crime Laboratory, where scientists developed a DNA profile from the biological material. The development of that profile represented an enormous step forward. The unknown offender was no longer simply a description based on witness memories or circumstances. Investigators now had a genetic signature. But a DNA profile is only as useful as the comparison available to investigators. If the profile does not match a known person, it can remain anonymous indefinitely. That was the situation in Barbarai's case. The profile existed. It could be tested. It could be preserved. But it did not produce a name. For years, the unknown male remained exactly that, unknown. The case could not move forward simply because investigators knew the killer's DNA. They needed to connect that DNA to a person. This is where the passage of time became both the enemy and the unexpected ally of the investigation. Time was the enemy because memories faded and witnesses aged. But time was also the ally because forensic technology continued to evolve. Laboratories became more sophisticated. Genetic databases expanded. Investigators began using techniques that could turn an unknown DNA profile into a genealogical clue. Genetic genealogy changed the landscape of cold case investigations by allowing investigators, under appropriate circumstances, to search for relatives of an unidentified person. Instead of waiting for the suspect himself to appear in a law enforcement database, investigators could potentially find distant relatives whose genetic information pointed toward the suspect's family. From there, genealogists could construct family trees and narrow the possibility. The technique was particularly powerful in cases where traditional investigative methods had reached a dead end. Barbarai's case became one of those cases. The old DNA profile was revisited. The goal was no longer simply to determine whether the unknown offender was already known to police. The goal was to discover whether the unknown DNA could reveal a family connection. The genealogical work eventually identified Robert Arthur Plimpton as a likely contributor, but investigators understood that a genealogy result was not the same thing as a courtroom conclusion. They needed a direct sample from Plimpton. That meant surveillance. They needed an opportunity to collect his DNA without compromising the investigation. Then, during surveillance, detectives observed Plimpton discard chewing gum. They recovered the gum and sent it to the Oregon State Police Crime Laboratory. That small piece of discarded material became a critical piece of evidence. The laboratory comparison confirmed the connection between Plimpton's DNA and the DNA profile developed from Barbarai's case. After decades of uncertainty, the evidence had finally crossed the final gap between an unidentified biological profile and a specific individual. This is the part of a cold case investigation that can be easy to misunderstand. The technology did not simply announce a name, it created a sequence of investigative possibilities. First, scientists developed the profile. Then investigators waited for a way to identify the person behind it. Genetic genealogy generated a lead. Detectives then obtained an independent DNA sample. Laboratory testing confirmed the match. Only after those steps could investigators move toward an arrest. Every stage required documentation and scientific analysis. Every stage had to withstand legal scrutiny, and every stage depended on the fact that the original evidence had survived. That survival was extraordinary. More than 40 years separated the collection of the evidence from the eventual identification of the suspect. During that period, the technology surrounding forensic science transformed, yet the biological material remained connected to the original crime. The DNA did not forget. It did not change its identity because decades had passed. It remained a biological record of the person who had contributed it. On June 8th, SIL 2021, Robert Plimpton was arrested. For the community, the announcement was shocking precisely because the case had been dormant for so long. Many people had grown up knowing Barbarai's murder only as an old, unsolved crime. Suddenly, there was an arrest. Suddenly, the name of the accused man was attached to a homicide that had been without a suspect for most of a lifetime. But the arrest also reopened the emotional wound for Barbarai's family. A cold case can become part of a family as permanent history. Relatives learn to live around the unanswered question. They may continue searching for information, speaking with investigators, remembering the victim, and wondering whether justice will ever come. When an arrest finally occurs, that long silence is broken. The result can be relief, but it can also bring grief back with unexpected force. The person who was killed is suddenly in the news again. The details of the crime return. Old memories return. The family is asked to revisit events they may have spent decades trying to process. Barbara Reyes' family had waited since 1980. Her sister Susan Pater later spoke publicly about the long wait and the importance of finally seeing the case move forward. For those closest to Barbara, the arrest did not mean that the years had been erased. It meant that the person accused of taking her life would finally have to answer in court. That distinction mattered. Justice is not the same as reversal. A conviction cannot restore a life. It cannot give a family back the decades they lost. But accountability has its own meaning. It establishes a public record. It identifies responsibility through the legal system. It tells a community that an old crime has not been forgotten. The case eventually went to trial in 2024. The prosecution presented the evidence connecting Plimpton to Barbara Reyes' murder. The DNA evidence formed the backbone of the case. The original biological evidence had produced the profile. The genetic genealogy had provided the investigative direction. The chewing gum sample had provided direct confirmation. The defense had the opportunity to challenge the evidence, as required in any criminal prosecution. The judge then had to determine whether the state had proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. On March 15th, SIL 2024, Judge Amy Baggio found Plimpton guilty of first-degree murder. The verdict was the culmination of an investigation that had begun more than 4 decades earlier. But the case did not end there. A conviction answered the question of guilt, but sentencing remained. On October 3rd, SIL 2024, Plimpton was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 40 years. The sentence closed the legal process, but it also placed the timeline of the case into stark perspective. Barbara had been 19 when she died. More than 44 years later, the man convicted of killing her received his sentence. The amount of time between those two moments is almost impossible to comprehend. Entire lives had unfolded while Barbara Reyes' case remained unresolved. The world had changed. Technology had transformed. Communities had grown. People who had not even been born when Barbara was killed were adults by the time her killer was convicted. Yet the evidence from that winter night remained relevant. The case demonstrated why cold case investigators continue to preserve biological evidence even when there appears to be no immediate path to an identification. A sample that cannot solve a case today may become decisive decades later. The tools change. The databases grow. The methods improve. What appears to be an unidentified piece of evidence can eventually become the key to a prosecution. Barbara Tucker's case became a powerful example of that principle. Her murder was not solved because the past suddenly became clearer on its own. It was solved because investigators refused to treat old evidence as worthless simply because it had failed to produce an answer in the past. The evidence was preserved. The profile was created. The case remained available for new technology. And eventually, a new generation of investigators was able to see possibilities that earlier investigators could not. The story is also a reminder that modern forensic breakthroughs often depend on decisions made decades earlier. Someone had to collect the evidence. Someone had to preserve it. Someone had to document it. Someone had to keep the case alive. Without those steps, genetic genealogy would have had nothing to work with. The technology may have been modern, but its foundation was created in 1980. That is why Barbara Reyes' case is more than a story about DNA. It is a story about time. It is a story about evidence surviving longer than the people who first collected it. It is a story about a family waiting for an answer while science continued moving forward. And it is a story about how an unknown genetic profile, once considered incapable of identifying its owner, eventually became the trail that led investigators to Robert Arthur Plimpton. The cold case had been silent for decades, but silence did not mean the evidence had disappeared. It meant the evidence was waiting. And when investigators finally possessed the tools to read it, the silence began to break. The most unsettling thing about the Barbara Tucker case was not simply that the killer remained unidentified for decades. It was that the evidence pointing toward him had existed long before anyone knew his name. Somewhere inside the biological material preserved from Barbara Reyes' body was a genetic signature that could eventually identify the man responsible, But for years, that signature remained nothing more than an unknown profile. The investigation had reached a strange kind of stalemate. Detectives knew they possessed evidence connected to the crime. They knew the evidence could potentially identify the perpetrator, yet there was no name attached to it, no database match, and no obvious path forward. The case had become a race between memory and science was still developing. In 1980, when Barbara May Tucker was murdered near Mount Hood Community College in Gresham, investigators were working in an era when forensic DNA profiling was not yet available as the transformative tool it would become. They could collect biological evidence, preserve it, and document it, but they could not immediately turn that evidence into a searchable genetic identity. The murder, therefore, remained anchored to traditional investigative method. Witnesses were questioned. The crime scene was examined. Barbara's movements were reconstructed. Investigators tried to understand what had happened during the critical period surrounding her disappearance. But the person responsible remained unidentified. Close to 7 p.m. on January 15th, Barbara was kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and beaten to death near a campus parking lot. The following morning, students arriving for class discovered her body in a wooded area between Kane Road and a school parking lot. The discovery transformed the campus. A place associated with education, routine, and young people had become the center of a murder investigation. The victim was only 19 years old. The brutality of the crime meant investigators had to confront the possibility that the offender was someone capable of extreme violence who had managed to disappear immediately afterward. The early investigation produced information, but not enough information. Time began to separate the investigators from the crime. Every year that passed made the original witnesses older. Every year made the case more distant from the detectives who had first worked it. Yet the biological evidence remained. That evidence became increasingly important as forensic science evolved. In 2000, vaginal swabs taken during Barbara's autopsy were submitted to the Oregon State Police Crime Laboratory. Scientists developed a DNA profile from the swabs. This was a major development, but it did not solve the case. The profile belonged to an unknown male. There was still no name. The DNA could potentially identify the person if a matching sample became available, but investigators had no direct match. For years, the profile remained in that frustrating space between certainty and identity. It was certain that the DNA belonged to someone. It was not known whose DNA it was. That distinction kept the case alive, but unsolved. Then the world of forensic investigation changed again. Genetic genealogy began giving investigators a way to approach unidentified DNA from a completely different direction. Instead of asking whether the suspect himself was already in a criminal database, investigators could search for biological relative. A relative did not need to know that their genetic information might eventually help solve a murder. The connection could be distant. A family tree could stretch across generations. Investigators could begin with genetic relationships and gradually narrow the possibilities. In Barbara's case, that approach became decisive. In early 2021, a genealogist working with Parabon Nanolabs identified Robert Arthur Plimpton as a likely contributor to the unknown DNA profile developed from the evidence collected in 2000. The name changed everything. For more than 40 years, investigators had been looking for an unidentified man. Now they had a specific individual to investigate. But detectives understood that the genealogical identification was only the beginning. They could not simply arrest someone because a genealogy analysis pointed toward him. They needed direct evidence. They needed to establish that Plimpton's DNA actually matched the DNA from Barbara's case. That required obtaining a reference sample. Gresham police detectives located Plimpton living in Troutdale and began surveillance. The investigation became quiet and deliberate. There was no dramatic confrontation, no police raid, no confession. Instead, detectives watched. They waited for an opportunity to obtain DNA that Plimpton had discarded. Eventually, that opportunity appeared in the form of something almost absurdly ordinary: chewing gum. Detectives observed Plimpton spit a piece of gum onto the ground. They collected it and submitted it to the Oregon State Police Crime Laboratory. The laboratory developed a DNA profile from the gum and compared it with the profile created from the biological evidence collected from Barbara. The result was decisive. The DNA profiles matched. The unknown male profile that investigators had carried since 2000 was now directly connected to Robert Arthur Plimpton. The mystery had suddenly become a criminal investigation with a named suspect. On June 8, SIL 2021, Plimpton was taken into custody and lodged at the Multnomah County Detention Center. The arrest came more than 40 years after Barbara Reyes' death. For the investigators involved, it represented an extraordinary example of how a cold case can change when old evidence meets new science. But the arrest also raised the stakes. Identifying a suspect is not the same as proving guilt. The prosecution would have to explain the evidence to a judge and establish that the DNA connection was meaningful within the circumstances of the murder. The case would eventually proceed to a bench trial before Multnomah County Judge Amy Baji. Unlike a jury trial, there would be no 12-person panel deciding the fact. The judge would hear the evidence and determine whether the prosecution had proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. The trial began on February 26th, SIL 2024. By then, Barbara Reyes' murder had become more than a 40-year-old cold case. It had become a test of whether modern forensic science could successfully carry an old investigation into a modern courtroom. The prosecution presented the history of the case, the original evidence, the DNA profile, the genealogical identification, and the later comparison from Plimpton's discarded gum. The chain was remarkable because every stage depended on the previous one. Without the original evidence, there would have been no DNA profile. Without the DNA profile, there would have been no genetic genealogy investigation. Without the genealogical lead, detectives would not have known which person to watch. Without the discarded chewing gum, investigators would not have had the direct comparison that linked Plimpton to the biological evidence. It was not one piece of evidence that solved Barbara Reyes' murder. It was a sequence that stretched across decades, and that sequence also demonstrated why the preservation of evidence matters so much in cold cases. At the time the original evidence was collected, investigators could not know what future laboratories would be capable of doing with it. They could not know that genetic genealogy would become a powerful investigative technique. They could not know that decades later, detectives would be able to identify a suspect from evidence that had remained unresolved for years. All they could do was preserve what they had. That decision became crucial. During the 2024 trial, the age of the evidence became part of the story itself. More than 4 decades had passed since Barbara was killed. The witnesses were no longer living in 1980. The detectives who had begun the original investigation were separated from the courtroom by an entire generation of technological change, yet the biological evidence remained capable of being tested. The prosecution's case was therefore built around a combination of old facts and modern forensic interpretation. Barbara had been murdered in 1980. The biological evidence had been collected then. The DNA profile had been developed in 2000. The genetic genealogy identification occurred in 2021. The direct DNA comparison followed, and the courtroom finally brought all of those dates together. For Barbara Reyes' family, the timeline was painful because it represented an enormous portion of a human life. 44 years had passed between the murder and Plimpton's eventual sentencing. Barbara never had the chance to experience those years. Her family did. They carried the loss through decades while the legal system had no person to hold responsible. The arrest changed that. The trial changed it further. And on March 15th, SIL 2024, Judge Boggio delivered the verdict. Plimpton was found guilty of first-degree murder as well as for counts representing different theories of second-degree murder. The verdict finally gave the case the one thing it had lacked since 1980, a judicial finding of responsibility. The cold case had become a conviction. Yet even then, the story was not simply about a courtroom victory. It was about the strange persistence of evidence. The killer had not been identified by a witness who suddenly remembered his fate. He had not walked into a police station and confessed. He had not been caught through a routine investigation decades earlier. He was identified because biological evidence had survived long enough for science to catch up with it. The evidence had been silent for years, but it had never stopped being evidence. And that is what made the case so haunting. The passage of time appeared to work in the killer's favor. Every year without an identification seemed to make the possibility of justice more remote, but the same years that separated the crime from the investigation also produced technologies capable of breaking the deadlock. The investigation was no longer limited by the tools of 1980. It had entered an era in which a genetic profile could become a genealogical map, and a genealogical map could become a suspect. The case demonstrated that a cold case is not necessarily a case without evidence. Sometimes it is a case with evidence that has not yet found its moment. Barbara Tucker-Rest's evidence found that moment more than 40 years after her death, and when it did, the past suddenly became present again. The name Robert Arthur Plimpton was no longer a distant possibility generated by genealogy. It was connected by direct DNA evidence to the biological material collected from Barbara. The arrest followed. The trial followed. The conviction followed. Then, on October 3rd, SIL 2024, Judge Kelly Skye sentenced Plimpton to life in prison with a minimum of 40 years to be served. The sentence closed a legal journey that had begun with a 19-year-old woman being found dead near a college campus in January 1980. More than 4 decades later, the courtroom had finally reached its conclusion. Barbara could not speak for herself, but the evidence could, and after 44 years, it finally had. For decades, the most powerful piece of evidence in Barbara Tucker-Rest's murder was something investigators could not use to name a suspect. It was invisible to the naked eye, impossible to photograph in the way a fingerprint could be photographed, and useless for identification until forensic science caught up with the crime. It was DNA. In 1980, that evidence could not tell investigators who had attacked Barbara. By 2000, it could provide a genetic profile. But even then, the profile had no name attached to it. The investigation had reached the edge of what the technology of the time could accomplish, and for years, the case remained suspended there. Then, more than 4 decades after Barbara Ray's death, investigators found a way to turn that anonymous genetic signature into a person. The transformation began with a simple idea. If the unknown DNA did not belong to anyone already identified in a law enforcement database, perhaps it could still be connected to someone through family. That was the promise of investigative genetic genealogy, and Barbara Ray's case became a striking example of how that method could reopen a murder investigation that had appeared frozen in time. The original evidence had come from Barbara herself. After her body was discovered on the morning of January 16th, SIL 1980, investigators conducted an autopsy and preserved biological evidence. Years later, in 2000, vaginal swabs from that examination were sent to the Oregon State Police Crime Laboratory. Scientists were able to develop a DNA profile from the swab. That profile represented an enormous scientific breakthrough, but it did not immediately answer the central question. Who was the man behind the DNA? There was no immediate match. The profile was therefore stored as an unknown. For investigators, this created a strange situation. They possessed a genetic identifier that could distinguish one person from another, but they did not know the identity behind it. The case remained open, but the trail seemed to disappear into the future. Barbara Ray's murder had already survived 20 years. Then another decade passed. Then another. By the time modern investigators began revisiting the case, more than 40 years had separated them from the original crime. The world in which Barbara had lived was almost unrecognizable compared with the world in which her killer was finally identified. But the DNA profile remained the same. Modern genetic genealogy offered investigators a new route. Rather than waiting for the offender himself to appear in a criminal database, investigators could search for genetic relatives and use those relationships to build a path toward the unknown individual. In 2021, a genealogist working with Parabon Nanolabs identified Robert Arthur Plimpton as a likely contributor to the unidentified DNA profile. It was a critical investigative breakthrough, but detectives still had to prove the connection. They could not simply take a genealogical prediction into court and declare the case solved. They needed a direct comparison. Gresham police detectives located Plimpton living in Troutdale and began surveillance. The investigation moved quietly. There was no public announcement. No dramatic confrontation, no warning that the past was about to catch up with him. Detectives watched and waited. Then came an ordinary action with extraordinary consequences. Plimpton spit a piece of chewing gum onto the ground. Detectives collected it. The discarded gum was sent to the Oregon State Police Crime Laboratory. Scientists extracted DNA from the sample and compared the resulting profile with the profile developed from Barbourey's vaginal swabs more than 20 years earlier. The result was a match. The genetic profile that had remained unidentified since 2000 was now directly associated with Robert Arthur Plimpton. The investigation had crossed the most important line in a cold case. Suspicion had become forensic evidence. On June 8th, SIL 2021, Plimpton was taken into custody and lodged at the Multnomah County Detention Center. The arrest shocked the community because Barbourey's murder had been without a publicly identified suspect for more than 40 years. A case that had begun in a college community in 1980 had suddenly returned to the headlines. The name Barbara Tucker was again connected to police statements, forensic evidence, prosecutors, and court proceedings. But beneath the excitement surrounding the arrest was a more difficult reality. An arrest was only an accusation. The prosecution still had to prove that Plimpton was responsible for Barbourey's murder. That meant taking evidence from 1980 and explaining it in a courtroom in 2024. It meant showing how the biological evidence had been collected, how the DNA profile had been developed, how genetic genealogy had identified a potential contributor, and how the independent DNA sample from the discarded gum confirmed the connection. It also meant addressing the human evidence surrounding Barbourey's final hour. Witnesses had seen her near Northeast Kane Drive on the night she disappeared. Their observations formed part of the original investigation. The circumstances of Barbourey's death provided additional context, but time had created an unavoidable complication. More than 40 years had passed. Memories were old. The world had changed. People who had witnessed events in 1980 were being asked to revisit them decades later. The prosecution, therefore, had to rely on a combination of historical testimony and modern forensic science. This was one of the defining characteristics of the case. The DNA evidence could survive decades with its genetic information intact, while human memory could not always offer the same certainty. That made the laboratory evidence particularly important. The biological profile did not depend on someone remembering Barbourey's face or remembering the exact words spoken on a winter evening. It was a scientific comparison between evidence collected during the original investigation and a reference sample obtained from the man investigators had identified. Yet even powerful forensic evidence must be presented within the rules of a criminal trial. The court had to determine whether the prosecution had proved guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Plimpton's case was heard as a bench trial before Multnomah County Judge Amy Baggio. The trial began on February 26th, SIL 2024, and continued until March 15th. For nearly 3 weeks, the evidence from one of Oregon's oldest cold cases was brought into a modern courtroom. The prosecution presented the investigation as a chain extending from the night Barbara was killed to the scientific work eventually identified Plimpton. The chain began with Barbourey's murder. It continued through the collection and preservation of biological evidence. In 2000, that evidence produced the DNA profile. In 2021, genetic genealogy generated the lead pointing toward Plimpton. Surveillance produced the discarded chewing gum. Laboratory analysis established the DNA match. The arrest followed. Now the court had to decide whether the entire chain established criminal responsibility. The significance of the case extended beyond Barbara and her family. It showed how the preservation of biological evidence can give a cold case a future even when the original investigation cannot identify the offender. In 1980, investigators could not have known what forensic laboratories would be able to accomplish decades later. They could not have predicted genetic genealogy. They could not have predicted the databases and computational tools that would eventually help investigators trace unknown DNA through family relationships. They could only collect what they found and preserve it as carefully as possible. That decision mattered. Without the original biological evidence, the later DNA profile would not have existed. Without that profile, there would have been nothing for genetic genealogy to analyze. Without the genealogical lead, detectives might never have known where to look. Without the discarded gum, they would not have had the direct comparison that connected Plimpton to the biological evidence. The solution was therefore not one miraculous discovery. It was a sequence of evidence surviving long enough for different generations of investigators and scientists to contribute to the same case. On March 15th, SIL 2024, Judge Baggio found Plimpton guilty of first-degree murder. She also found him guilty on 4 counts representing different theories of second-degree murder. The verdict brought a legal conclusion to the central question that had remained unanswered since 1980, but the emotional consequences were much harder to resolve. Barbara had been 19 years old when she was killed. She had never reached adulthood in the way her family expected. She never experienced the decades that followed. Her family did. They carried her memory through every passing year while the case remained unresolved. The verdict could establish accountability, but it could not restore those lost years. It could not return Barbara to her family. It could not erase the violence of that night. It could only establish, through the legal system, that the evidence was sufficient to hold Plimpton responsible. Then came sentencing. On October 3rd, SIL 2024, Judge Kelly Skye sentenced Plimpton to life in prison with a minimum of 40 years to be served. He was immediately transferred into the custody of the Oregon Department of Correction. More than 44 years had passed since Barbara Reyes' murder. The distance between those two dates was almost impossible to comprehend. A 19-year-old college student had been killed in 1980. Her killer remained unidentified for decades. Then, modern forensic science reached backward through time and found him. The case had begun with a body in a wooded area near a college parking lot. It ended with a conviction based in significant part on evidence preserved from that same crime. The most haunting lesson was that the evidence had never stopped speaking. For years, investigators simply did not have the tools to understand everything it could say. The DNA profile created in 2000 was not a failure. It was a message without an address. Genetic genealogy supplied a possible address. The discarded gum supplied the direct comparison. The laboratory supplied the confirmation. The courtroom supplied the verdict. And the sentence finally closed the legal process. Barbara Tucker's name had remained attached to an unanswered question for most of a lifetime. Now that question had an answer. The cold case was no longer cold. It had become a solved murder, a conviction, and a permanent reminder of how dramatically forensic investigation has changed. The killer had relied on time, but time had not destroyed the evidence. It had carried that evidence forward until science became capable of using it. And somewhere between the old evidence room, the modern laboratory, the genealogical database, and a discarded piece of chewing gum, the 40-year silence surrounding Barbara Tucker was finally broken. The arrest of Robert Arthur Plimpton did something that had seemed impossible for most of Barbara Tucker's family. It gave a face and a name to the unknown person who had occupied the darkest corner of their lives for more than 40 years. But an arrest was only the beginning of the final legal chapter. The case still had to survive the courtroom, and that meant taking a murder investigation that had begun in January 1980 and reconstructing it with evidence gathered across for different decades. The passage of time was everywhere. Barbara was 19 when she was killed. The detectives who had first responded to the case belonged to another era of policing. The witnesses had aged. The technology had transformed, and the suspect who now stood before the court was no longer the person investigators had been searching for in the winter of 1980. Yet the prosecution had one powerful advantage that time had not been able to erase. The biological evidence, that evidence, connected the beginning of the investigation to its eventual conclusion. Barbara Reyes' body had been found on January 16th, SIL 1980, in a wooded area near Mount Hood Community College. She had been kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and beaten to death. The crime scene became the starting point for an investigation that would stretch far beyond the expectations of the detectives working it. In those first hours, investigators had to determine what had happened to Barbara and who could have been responsible. Witnesses had seen her near Northeast Kane Drive on the night of January 15th. Their observations suggested that Barbara had been in distress and may have been attempting to attract the attention of passing motorists. One witness reported seeing a man near her. These fragments were important, but they were not enough to identify the attack. The case therefore remained dependent on physical evidence and investigative leads. Decades later, that physical evidence would become the strongest connection between the original crime and the man eventually convicted. When investigators developed a DNA profile from biological material collected during Barbara Reyes' autopsy in 2000, they had achieved something extraordinary for the time. But the breakthrough remained incomplete. The profile did not immediately identify anyone. It was a genetic signature without a name. That distinction would define the case for years. Investigators could compare the profile against available databases, but if the person responsible was not represented in those systems, the search could go nowhere. The profile could remain unmatched indefinitely. That was the reality confronting investigators for much of the next 2 decades. The case was not without evidence. It was without an identity. The difference was crucial. The evidence could wait. The family could not. As the years passed, Barbara Reyes' murder became one of those cases that seemed to exist in 2 worlds. To the public, it was an old tragedy. To investigators, it remained an unresolved homicide. To Barbara Reyes' family, it was neither old nor distant. It was the permanent absence of a 19-year-old woman. Then, forensic genealogy changed the possibilities. Modern investigators could approach the unidentified DNA differently. Rather than relying entirely on a direct database match, genetic genealogy could potentially identify relatives of the unknown contributor. Those relatives could provide the starting points for genealogical research. The process could narrow an enormous number of possibilities until investigators reached an individual whose identity could be tested directly in Barbara Reyes' case. That process eventually pointed toward Plimpton. The significance of that moment cannot be overstated. For more than 40 years, the investigation had been built around an unknown man. Suddenly, there was a specific individual. But detectives knew that the science had to be confirmed independently. A genealogical lead could guide investigators, but it could not substitute for direct forensic comparison. That was why the surveillance operation became so important. Detectives located Plimpton in Troutdale and observed him. They waited for an opportunity to obtain DNA that he had voluntarily discarded. Eventually, they recovered a piece of chewing gum that Plimpton had thrown away. It was an ordinary object connected to an extraordinary investigation. The laboratory testing of that sample produced the direct match investigators needed. The DNA from the gum matched the DNA profile developed from evidence collected in Barbara Reyes' case. The unknown profile now had a confirmed identity. On June 8th, SIL 2021, Plimpton was arrested. The news represented an enormous shift in the case, but it also created a new set of questions. What could be proven? How much of the original investigation could still be reconstructed? Would the court accept the forensic evidence as reliable? Could the prosecution demonstrate beyond a reasonable doubt that the man whose DNA matched the biological evidence was responsible for Barbara Reyes' murder? Those questions became central when the case proceeded to trial. The bench trial began on February 26th, SIL 2024, before Multnomah County Judge Amy Baggio. Instead of a jury deciding the evidence, the judge would determine whether the prosecution had established guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution had to present the case as a complete evidentiary chain. The chain began with Barbara Reyes' murder and the evidence collected afterward. It continued with the DNA profile developed in 2000. It moved into the modern era with genetic genealogy and the identification of Plimpton as a likely contributor. It then reached the direct DNA comparison from the discarded chewing gum. Every stage had to connect logically to the next. The importance of the biological evidence was not simply that it existed. It was that it had remained available and usable. The original investigators could not have known that scientists decades later would be able to analyze the evidence in ways unavailable in 1980, but they preserved it. That preservation created the possibility of a future breakthrough. In court, the passage of time therefore became part of the story rather than an obstacle that automatically destroyed it. The prosecution could show that the scientific profile had been developed long before Plimpton was identified. That meant the DNA evidence was not created because investigators already suspected him. The genetic profile existed independently. Only later did investigative genealogy point toward him. Then detectives obtained a separate sample for direct comparison. The sequence mattered because it demonstrated how the identification developed rather than simply asserting that investigators had decided on a suspect and searched for evidence afterward. The case also demonstrated how cold case investigations can combine old-fashioned police work with advanced science. Genetic genealogy provided an investigative direction, but detectives still had to locate Plimpton and obtain a reference sample. Laboratory scientists still had to analyze that sample. Prosecutors still had to present the result, and the judge still had to decide whether the evidence satisfied the legal standard. No single tool solved Barbara Reyes' murder by itself. The solution emerged from the interaction of several investigative methods developed over different generations. As the trial progressed, Barbara Reyes' story remained at the center. Behind every laboratory number was a 19-year-old woman who had gone to Mount Hood Community College and never returned to the life she was supposed to have. Her death had created a void that decades could not fill. Her family had lived without knowing who was responsible. The arrest had changed the uncertainty into an accusation. The trial would determine whether that accusation became a legal finding. The emotional weight of the proceeding was intensified by the enormous amount of time involved. In a typical homicide case, the investigation and trial may occur within months or years of the crime. Barbara Reyes' case was different. The courtroom was examining events from a period when many of the technologies used in the prosecution did not exist. The DNA profile that became central to the case had been developed 20 years after Barbara Reyes' murder. The genetic genealogy that helped identify Plimpton belonged to another generation entirely. The court was effectively bringing evidence across time and asking whether it could still speak clearly. The answer came on March 15th. 2024, Judge Baggio found Robert Arthur Plimpton guilty of first-degree murder. She also found him guilty on 4 counts representing different theories of second-degree murder. After more than 4 decades, the legal system had reached a finding of responsibility. The verdict was not the end of Barbara Reyes' story, but it changed the meaning of the case forever. The word unknown, which had defined the investigation for so long, was gone. There was now a conviction. There was now an official judgment. There was now a record establishing that the evidence presented in court had been sufficient to prove Plimpton's guilt. Yet the verdict could not reverse what had happened in 1980. It could not restore Barbara Reyes' future or return the years her family had spent waiting. Justice in a cold case often arrives carrying that contradiction. It can provide accountability while leaving the original loss untouched. Then, on October 3rd, SIL 2024, Judge Kelly Skye sentenced Plimpton to life in prison with a minimum of 40 years to be served. The sentence marked the final legal consequence of a crime committed more than 44 years earlier. A murder that had begun with an unidentified attacker ended with a convicted man entering the custody of the Oregon Department of Corrections. The distance between those 2 moments was extraordinary, but the connection between them was surprisingly small. Biological evidence collected after Barbara's death, that evidence had survived long enough to become useful. The investigation had survived long enough to take advantage of it. And Barbara Reyes' name had remained attached to the case long enough for modern science to give the evidence a voice. The final lesson of the case was not that time always solves crimes. It does not. It was that time does not necessarily destroy every possibility of justice. Sometimes evidence survives. Sometimes technology advances. Sometimes investigators return to cases that earlier generations could not solve. And sometimes a mystery that appears permanently frozen can suddenly move again. Barbara Tucker's murder had remained unanswered through years of silence, but the evidence had never stopped pointing toward the truth. It simply took decades before anyone could follow the trail all the way to its end. The conviction of Robert Arthur Plimpton brought an official end to the legal uncertainty surrounding Barbara Tucker's murder, but it could never erase the question that had haunted the people closest to her for decades. How could a case remain unsolved for so long when the evidence that ultimately identified the killer had been collected from the beginning? The answer lies in the enormous distance between what investigators knew in 1980 and what forensic science could reveal decades later. When Barbara was killed, investigators could examine a crime scene, interview witnesses, collect biological material, document injuries, and preserve evidence, but they could not take an unknown biological sample and immediately search for the person who had left it behind. The technology simply did not exist in a practical form. That limitation shaped everything that followed. Barbara Reyes' murder occurred on January 15th, SIL 1980, near Mount Hood Community College in Gresham, Oregon. She was 19 years old. By the next morning, her body had been discovered in a wooded area near a campus parking lot. Investigators immediately began trying to reconstruct what had happened. Witnesses had seen Barbara near Northeast Kane Drive. Some observations suggested she was in distress. A man had reportedly been seen near her, but no witness could provide investigators with a complete picture. There was no single moment when someone saw the attacker clearly enough to end the investigation. Instead, detectives were left with fragments: a frightened young woman, a roadway, a nearby campus, a wooded area, a man who disappeared, and biological evidence that would not reveal its full meaning for decades. The early investigation, therefore, depended heavily on traditional police work. Detectives followed leads and examined Barbara Reyes' movement. They considered possible suspects and tried to determine who had been around the campus that evening. But without the modern tools available today, identifying the offender was extremely difficult. A cold case is often described as a mystery that has gone dormant, but Barbara Reyes' case was more accurately a problem without a technological solution. Investigators had evidence, but the tools needed to interpret all of it were still in the future. 20 years after the murder, that future began to arrive. In 2000, vaginal swabs collected during Barbara Reyes' autopsy were submitted to the Oregon State Police Crime Laboratory. Scientists were able to develop a DNA profile from the biological material. The significance of that development was enormous. The investigators now had a genetic profile that could potentially distinguish the perpetrator from every other person in the world. Yet the profile still did not produce an identity. No matching person appeared in the available databases. The case therefore remained unsolved, even though the scientific evidence had become far more precise. It was a paradox. Investigators knew what the perpetrator's genetic signature looked like, but they did not know the person who carried it. That unknown profile remained in the case for years. Then, forensic genealogy transformed the possibility. Genetic genealogy allowed investigators to use relationships between people rather than relying exclusively on direct matches. An unknown DNA profile could potentially be compared against genealogy databases to identify relatives. Those relatives could reveal family connections. Family connections could produce a tree. The tree could narrow the possibilities. Eventually, investigators could arrive at a person who could be tested directly. This approach became particularly valuable in cases where traditional databases had failed to identify the suspect. Barbara Reyes' murder was one of those cases. In early 2021, genealogical research conducted with the assistance of Parabon Nanolabs identified Robert Arthur Plimpton as a likely contributor to the unknown DNA profile. For the first time, investigators had a concrete identity to investigate. But the process did not end there. Investigators understood that a genealogical prediction needed confirmation. They located Plimpton living in Troutdale and placed him under surveillance. Their objective was straightforward: obtain a DNA sample without compromising the investigation. Then they saw Plimpton discard chewing gum. Detectives recovered the gum and submitted it for laboratory analysis. The sample provided exactly what investigators needed. The DNA profile obtained from the chewing gum matched the profile developed from the biological evidence collected in Barbara Reyes' case. After more than 40 years, the unknown DNA had finally been connected directly to a specific person. The arrest followed on June 8th, SIL 2021, for a case that had remained unresolved since 1980. The speed of the final stage was startling, but the breakthrough was not created overnight. It was built from decades of preservation and technological development. The DNA evidence had existed since the original investigation. The profile had existed since 2000. The genealogical tools came later. The surveillance and reference sample came later still. The arrest was the final visible moment in a process that had been quietly unfolding for years. Once Plimpton was arrested, the case entered a new phase. Investigators were no longer asking only who the unknown man was. Prosecutors now had to prove what he had done. The difference was fundamental. Identification is not the same as guilt. A DNA match can be powerful evidence, but the prosecution still has to establish how that evidence relates to the charged crime and prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. That burden remained unchanged despite the age of the case. The trial began on February 26th, SIL 2024, before Multnomah County Judge Amy Baggio. The prosecution presented evidence from the original investigation and the modern forensic work that ultimately identified Plimpton. The case was heard without a jury, meaning the judge would determine the facts and the verdict. The courtroom became the place where 44 years of investigation were compressed into a legal proceeding. The original crime scene had long since become part of history, but the evidence collected there remained relevant. The biological evidence had not aged in the same way that memories had. The DNA profile could still be tested, the direct comparison could still be performed, and the genetic connection could still be examined. This gave the prosecution something rare in an old homicide case, a forensic bridge between the original crime and the modern defendant. Yet the emotional dimensions of the case were impossible to separate from the science. Barbara was 19 when she died. Her family had spent decades without knowing who was responsible. The uncertainty was not merely an investigative problem, it was a permanent condition of their lives. There was no name to associate with the loss, no person to blame, no courtroom in which the evidence could be presented. Every year without an arrest extended that uncertainty. The arrest in 2021 changed the emotional landscape immediately, but it also reopened the wound. A suspect now existed where there had previously been only an unknown offender. Barbara Ray's name returned to the news. The details of the crime were discussed again. The family had to confront the reality that the man accused of killing her had lived for decades while they carried her absent. The trial therefore represented both an opportunity for justice and a painful return to the worst moment of their lives. As the evidence was presented, the story of the case became a demonstration of how forensic science can alter the trajectory of a cold case. The DNA profile developed in 2000 had not been enough to identify Plimpton. Genetic genealogy created the lead. The discarded gum produced the direct match. Traditional detective work connected the forensic information to a living suspect. Prosecutors then carried the evidence into court. It was a chain built by different generations of investigators and scientists. The case could not have been solved in 1980 with the technology available then. But it could eventually be solved because the investigators preserved what they had. That is, one of the most important lessons in forensic investigation. Evidence does not always reveal its value immediately. A sample can remain unidentified for years and still become decisive later. Technology changes, databases expand, analytical techniques improve. Investigators learn new ways to approach old problems, but none of those advances matter if the original evidence has been lost or destroyed. Barbara Ray's case survived because a crucial biological record survived with it. On March 15th, SIL 2024, Judge Baggio delivered the verdict. Plimpton was found guilty of first-degree murder and 4 counts representing different theories of second-degree murder. The verdict was a moment that had seemed impossible for most of Barbara Ray's family history. A case that had begun with uncertainty now had a legal conclusion. The person identified through genetic genealogy and direct DNA testing had been found guilty by the court. But the story still carried a painful contradiction. Barbara Ray's family had received an answer, but they could never receive Barbara back. The verdict could establish responsibility. It could not restore a 19-year-old life. It could not return the years that had passed. It could not erase the memory of a young woman who should have grown older but never did. Then came the final legal consequence. On October 3rd, SIL 2024, Plimpton was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 40 years to be served. The sentence represented the culmination of more than 4 decades of investigation. From the wooded area near the college parking lot in 1980 to the courtroom in 2024, the case had traveled through an extraordinary transformation. The technology changed, the investigators changed, the world changed, but the evidence remained. That evidence ultimately became the thread that connected Barbara Ray's death to the man convicted of causing it. The cold case had been solved because the past had not been completely lost. It had been preserved. It had been waiting. And when the right technology arrived, the evidence finally became capable of telling investigators what it had been holding for more than 40 years. Barbara Tucker-Rest's murder had once seemed destined to remain a question without an answer. Instead, it became a case that demonstrated the extraordinary persistence of forensic evidence. The killer had disappeared into the passage of time, but the DNA did not disappear with him. It remained where investigators had left it, carrying a genetic signature across decades until science finally caught up. And when it did, the silence that had surrounded Barbara Ray's murder for most of her family's lifetime was broken. The final chapter of Barbara Tucker-Rest's case was not really about the moment of arrest, and it was not even about the moment the DNA match was announced. It was about what happened when a crime that had remained unresolved for 40 years was finally forced into the present, when evidence collected in 1980 was placed before a judge in 2024, and the silence surrounding a 19-year-old woman's death was challenged by facts that had survived longer than anyone could have expected. Robert Arthur Plimpton had been identified in early 2021 through DNA evidence found on Barbara Ray's body with genealogical work by Parabon Nanolabs, helping investigators identify him as a likely contributor to the unknown profile developed years earlier. Detectives with the Gresham Police Department then located him in Troutdale and began surveillance. The investigation was quiet because the detectives knew that the most important evidence still had to be obtained. They needed a direct DNA comparison. When investigators saw Plimpton spit a piece of chewing gum onto the ground, they recovered it and sent it to the Oregon State Police Crime Laboratory. The laboratory determined that the DNA profile from the gum matched the DNA profile developed from the vaginal swabs taken during Barbara Ray's autopsy. The unknown profile finally had a confirmed identity. On June 8th, SIL 2021, Plimpton was taken into custody and lodged at the Multnomah County Detention Center. But the arrest did not close the case. It opened another chapter, one that would force prosecutors to take the evidence of a 1980 murder and explain it to a court more than 4 decades later. The trial began on February 26th, SIL 2024, before Multnomah County Judge Amy Baggio. It was a bench trial, meaning there would be no jury. The judge would hear the evidence, examine the arguments, and ultimately decide whether the prosecution had proven Plimpton guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The case was extraordinary because of the distance between the crime and the courtroom. Barbara had been 19 years old when she was killed. By the time the trial began, she had been gone for more than 44 years. The evidence had crossed generations. The original investigators had worked without the forensic technology that later became central to the prosecution. The DNA profile had been developed in 2000, 2 decades after Barbara Ray's death. Genetic genealogy had become a major investigative tool only much later, and the direct DNA comparison that identified Plimpton came from an object discarded decades after the crime. The prosecution, therefore, had to explain not only what the evidence showed, but how the investigation had evolved from one generation to another. According to the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office, Barbara was kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and beaten to death close to 7 p.m. on January 15th, SIL 1980, near a campus parking lot at Mount Hood Community College. Students arriving for class the next morning discovered her body in a wooded area between Kane Road and a school parking lot. Those facts formed the foundation of the prosecution's case. The biological evidence then created the forensic connection. In 2000, vaginal swabs taken during Barbara Ray's autopsy were analyzed by the Oregon State Police Crime Laboratory, which developed the unknown male DNA profile. More than 20 years later, investigators were finally able to connect that profile to Plimpton. The sequence mattered. The DNA profile existed before investigators knew who Plimpton was. The genealogical investigation created the lead. The discarded gum created the direct comparison. The laboratory confirmed the match. That chain gave the prosecution a powerful evidentiary framework. But a criminal trial is not simply an exercise in finding a suspect. It is a test of whether the evidence proves guilt. The state had to establish its case beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense had the opportunity to challenge the evidence and the prosecution's interpretation. The court had to consider the evidence presented during the trial rather than the public perception of a cold case that had suddenly returned to the headline. That distinction is important because the emotional power of a decades-old murder can never replace the legal standard required for conviction. The prosecution needed evidence, and the evidence had to withstand scrutiny. The trial continued until March 15, 2024. On that day, Judge Boggio delivered the verdict. Robert Arthur Plimpton was found guilty of 1 count of murder in the first degree and 4 counts representing different theories of murder in the second degree. After more than 40 years, the legal system had finally answered the central question of the case. The unknown offender was no longer unknown. The DNA profile was no longer anonymous. The investigation was no longer waiting for a breakthrough. There had been an arrest, a trial, and now a conviction. For Barbara's family, the verdict represented long-awaited closure. But closure is a complicated word. It does not mean forgetting. It does not mean that the murder becomes less tragic. It does not mean that 44 years of grief disappear in a courtroom. It means something more limited and more concrete. It means that the question of responsibility has finally been addressed through the legal system. The family no longer had to live with the same uncertainty that had followed them since 1980. There was now an official verdict. There was now an established legal record. There was now accountability for the crime that had taken Barbara's life. But Barbara herself remained 19 forever. That was the cruelest fact beneath every legal development. She never saw the technology that eventually identified her killer. She never knew that detectives would one day be able to create a DNA profile from evidence collected after her death. She never knew that genetic genealogy would eventually help investigators trace that profile to a name. She never knew that detectives would watch the suspect from a distance and recover a discarded piece of gum. She never knew that a judge would eventually pronounce him guilty. All of those events happened after her death. Her only connection to them was the evidence she left behind and the memory preserved by the people who loved her. The passage of time, therefore, created one of the most striking contradictions in the entire case. The same decades that separated Barbara's family from the possibility of justice also created the technology that made justice possible. In 1980, the biological evidence could be collected but not fully interpreted. In 2000, the evidence could produce a DNA profile but not an identity. In 2021, genetic genealogy created a path toward a suspect. Then direct DNA testing established the match. The investigation was not solved by one technological miracle. It was solved through a sequence of scientific advances built upon evidence that had survived from the original crime. The Multnomah County District Attorney's Office specifically credited Gresham police detectives, Oregon State Police Crime Laboratory forensic expert, and Parabon Labs for work that was instrumental in bringing justice to Barbara's family and friends. The case therefore became an example of how cold case investigations can depend on cooperation between different disciplines. Detectives investigate, genealogists trace relationships, laboratory scientists analyze biological evidence, prosecutors build the legal case, judges evaluate the evidence. Each part has a different function. None can replace the others. And when those parts align, a case that once appeared impossible can suddenly move. The final stage came on October 3rd, 2024. Judge Kelly Sky sentenced Plimpton to life in prison with a minimum of 40 years to be served. He was immediately transferred into the custody of the Oregon Department of Correction. The sentence gave the case a final legal endpoint. More than 44 years after Barbara was killed, the man convicted of her murder received a life sentence. The timeline itself was almost incomprehensible. Barbara died in 1980. The DNA profile was developed in 2000. Plimpton was identified in 2021. He was convicted in 2024. He was sentenced to life in prison that same year. For decades of uncertainty had been compressed into a sequence of forensic discoveries and courtroom decisions. But the most powerful part of the story was not the length of the sentence. It was the survival of the evidence. A piece of biological material collected during Barbara Ray's autopsy remained useful decades later. The profile generated from that evidence became the foundation for genetic genealogy. A discarded piece of chewing gum later provided the direct comparison. The evidence that investigators could not fully use in 1980 became the evidence that helped solve the case in the 21st century. The killer had been separated from the crime by time. The evidence had not, and that difference changed everything. Cold cases often appear to disappear into history. The headlines fade. The investigators move on. The families age. The locations change. The world forgets details. But physical evidence can remain locked in a different timeline. It can wait without becoming impatient. It can remain unchanged while technology around it evolves. Barbara Tucker's case demonstrated that reality with unusual clarity. The evidence did not suddenly appear in 2021. It had been there for years. What changed was the ability to understand it. The investigation, therefore, became a story about patience as much as science. Someone had to preserve the evidence long enough for a future investigator to use it. Someone had to revisit the case when new methods became available. Someone had to follow the genealogical lead instead of assuming that an old, unidentified profile was a dead end. Someone had to watch the suspect and recover the discarded gum. Someone had to take that sample to the laboratory. Someone had to present the results in court. And finally, someone had to decide whether the evidence met the legal standard. The answer, in 2024, was yes. Barbara Ray's case had reached its conclusion. Yet even after the conviction and sentence, one image remains difficult to forget. A 19-year-old college student caught in the final hours of a life that should have continued for decades. Her death became a cold case. Her evidence became a genetic profile. Her genetic profile became a genealogical lead. The lead became a suspect. The suspect became a defendant. The defendant became a convicted murderer, and the convicted murderer became a prisoner serving life. That transformation took 44 years. It is impossible to recover all that was lost during those years. But the final result established something the family had been denied for most of their lives. The murder of Barbara Tucker had not been forgotten. Her name had remained in the records. Her evidence had remained in the laboratory. Her case had remained available for another generation of investigators. And when science finally provided the missing link, the truth that had been hidden for decades could no longer remain anonymous. The night Barbara died had created a mystery. The years turned that mystery into a cold case. Modern forensic science turned the cold case into an investigation again, and the courtroom turned that investigation into a conviction. The silence had lasted for more than 40 years. It did not end because someone suddenly remembered everything. It ended because the evidence remembered enough. The sentence in October 2024 closed the courtroom chapter of Barbara Tucker's murder. But it did not erase the decades that came before it. For the people who had carried Barbara Ray's memory since 1980, justice arrived after an almost unimaginable wait. The legal system had finally established responsibility, yet the emotional story was much older than the prosecution itself. It began with a 19-year-old woman whose life ended violently near Mount Hood Community College and continued through years of unanswered questions, investigative dead ends, technological change, and the eventual discovery that the evidence had been waiting all along. Barbara Ray's case demonstrates one of the strangest realities of cold case investigations. Sometimes the investigation does not fail because evidence is absent. It fails because the available evidence cannot yet be transformed into an identity. In 1980, investigators could collect biological evidence, but they could not use modern DNA profiling to identify an unknown offender. The technology that would later become central to Barbara Ray's case had not yet become part of ordinary criminal investigations. What investigators did have was evidence, and that evidence was preserved. That decision would become critical decades later. Was killed on January 15th, SIL 1980. According to the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office, she was kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and beaten to death close to 7 p.m. near a campus parking lot at Mount Hood Community College. Her body was discovered the following morning in a wooded area between Kane Road and a school parking lot. The crime shocked the local community, but shock does not automatically produce answers. Investigators worked the case, but the person responsible remained unidentified. The investigation entered the long and difficult territory of an unresolved homicide. Years passed. The case became older, but Barbara did not become less important to the people who knew her. Her family continued living with the absence created by her death. Her friends continued carrying memories of someone who had been 19 years old when her life was taken. And the case remained in law enforcement records, waiting for something capable of changing its direction. In 2000, 20 years after Barbara Ray's death, investigators submitted vaginal swabs collected during her autopsy to the Oregon State Police Crime Laboratory. Scientists developed an unknown male DNA profile. The result was significant because it transformed biological evidence into a precise genetic identifier. But it was still incomplete. The profile had no name. No direct match was available. The investigation now possessed something that could theoretically identify the killer, but there was no known person against whom to compare it. This became the central problem of the case. The DNA existed, but the identity did not. That problem remained for years until investigative genetic genealogy created a new route. The technique could allow investigators to search for genetic relatives of an unknown contributor and use genealogical relationships to narrow the field. Instead of asking whether the killer had already been identified by police, investigators could ask whether his family connections might lead them to him. In early 2021, genealogical research with the assistance of Parabon Nanolabs identified Robert Arthur Plimpton as a likely contributor to the unknown DNA profile. The name changed the investigation immediately, but detectives still needed direct evidence. They located Plimpton living in Troutdale and began surveillance. The objective was to obtain a DNA sample that could be compared against the profile from Barbara Ray's case. That opportunity came when Plimpton discarded chewing gum. Detectives collected the gum and sent it to the Oregon State Police Crime Laboratory. The resulting DNA profile matched the profile from the biological evidence connected to Barbara Ray's murder. The unknown contributor had become an identified person. On June 8, SIL 2021, Plimpton was arrested. For Barbara Ray's family, the arrest represented a dramatic change after decades of uncertainty. But it also meant that the past was suddenly alive again. A cold case that had existed mostly in memory and records was now becoming a contemporary criminal proceeding. Investigators had to prepare the evidence. Prosecutors had to build a case. The court had to evaluate the facts. And the family had to confront details that had remained painful for more than 40 years. The trial began on February 26th. SIL 2024, before Multnomah County Judge Amy Baggio. It was a bench trial, so the judge, rather than a jury, would determine the verdict. The prosecution's case was built around the connection between the original biological evidence and Plimpton's DNA. The importance of the evidence lay in the chronology. The original biological material had been collected long before Plimpton was publicly identified. The DNA profile had been created in 2000. Genetic genealogy later produced the investigative lead. Detectives then obtained an independent sample from Plimpton. The laboratory comparison established the match. The evidence therefore formed a continuous path from the original crime to the defendant standing before the court. That path was the product of decades of technological development. It was also the product of persistence. A cold case can only be solved when investigators continue to preserve and revisit evidence. If the biological evidence from Barbara Ray's autopsy had not been preserved, the DNA profile would not have existed. Without the profile, there would have been no genetic genealogy investigation. Without the genealogical lead, investigators might not have known where to look. Without the discarded chewing gum, they would not have had the direct comparison necessary to connect Plimpton to the DNA profile. The final result was therefore the product of multiple stages rather than one spectacular breakthrough. The trial also demonstrated the difference between an investigative lead and courtroom evidence. Genetic genealogy helped investigators identify Plimpton as a likely contributor, but detectives still obtained a direct DNA sample. That distinction was essential. The courtroom required evidence that could be tested and challenged. The direct comparison between the DNA from the discarded gum and the DNA profile from Barbara Reyes' case provided that connection. The scientific evidence then became part of the larger prosecution narrative. On March 15, SIL 2024, Judge Baggio found Plimpton guilty of first-degree murder and 4 counts representing different theories of second-degree murder. The verdict finally transformed the case from an unresolved investigation into a conviction. The word unknown that had defined the offender for decades was replaced by a legal finding of responsibility. For Barbara Ray's family, that moment carried an emotional weight that cannot be measured simply by the language of a verdict. A conviction does not return a person. It does not restore the years that disappeared. It does not erase the images associated with a violent death, but it does establish that the crime has been acknowledged and that the person found responsible has been held accountable. The sentencing followed on October 3rd, SIL 2024. Judge Kelly Skye sentenced Plimpton to life in prison with a minimum of 40 years to be served. He was immediately transferred to the custody of the Oregon Department of Corrections. The sentence represented the final legal consequence of a crime that had remained unresolved for most of a lifetime. Barbara had been 19 when she was killed. By the time the sentence was imposed, more than 4 decades had passed. The timeline alone reveals how unusual the case was. An entire generation had grown up while the identity of Barbara Reyes' killer remained unknown. People who were children in 1980 could become grandparents before the case reached its conclusion. Technology that did not exist when Barbara died became central to identifying the person convicted of killing her. The investigation, therefore, became a bridge between 2 eras of forensic science. The first era preserved evidence without knowing how powerful it would eventually become. The second era possessed the tools to interpret that evidence in ways earlier investigators could not. The case also demonstrated why cold case investigations continue to matter even when decades have passed. Time changes circumstances, but it does not necessarily erase evidence. A DNA profile does not become less genetically accurate simply because the case is old. A preserved sample can remain useful long after the investigators who collected it have retired. The challenge is finding the method capable of turning that evidence into a lead. Barbara Reyes' case found that method through genetic genealogy. The broader significance is difficult to ignore. For decades, the unknown DNA profile represented frustration. Then the same profile became the starting point for a new investigation. Instead of being a dead end, it became a map. That map eventually led investigators to Plimpton. Direct testing confirmed the connection. The courtroom established guilt. The sentence followed. The case that once seemed trapped in 1980 had finally entered the 21st century. But even after the legal conclusion, Barbara remained at the center of the story. She was not simply a DNA profile. She was not simply a case number. She was a 19-year-old woman whose future had been taken away. Her family had to live with that loss while the investigation continued in the background. Every new forensic development created a possibility, but also another period of waiting. The arrest